G'day, brothers and sisters. This is the other Paul, and we are now here for an incredibly special interview with none other than Dr. Stephen Wolfe himself. Dr. Wolfe, how are you going this fine Australian morning?
Yeah, great. It's evening out here, but yeah, it's going great. I spent the day outside most of the day, so it was fun, and here I am. So glad to be here.
Excellent, excellent. And it is definitely an honor to have you as well for an incredibly important topic. But if by a incredibly slim chance people watching don't know who you are, could you introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, I guess so. So I wrote the book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, and I live in North Carolina. I live on several acres and kind of a building. I don't know what building up the property is what I was doing today. Hopefully a future vineyard and all that. We're working on it, but
Nice.
so that and 4 kids, married, have a dog, 30 chickens, 5 goats, and we'll see how that goes. Maybe more in the future. So that's basically me. Some people want to know credentials. You said doctor, which I usually don't expect or care that people call me that, but yeah, so PhD at LSU in political theory or political thought. I have a master's in philosophy and political science, and I also spent a year at Princeton doing some work. So yeah, but here I am. So that's mostly what I do is I write and yeah, touch grass outside, I guess. Plant grass and touch grass. I try to do a little both.
Wow, you actually touch grass. You don't just read obscure reformers all day.
Yeah, I think it's hilarious sometimes when someone will tweet back, "Oh, Wolf, go touch grass." And it's like, dude, I'm literally outside with a shovel in my hand, shoveling like crap or something, So like, it's like I'm literally outside tweeting. Like I got a shovel full of crap, and I said, "Oh, that'd be a good tweet. That wouldn't get me in trouble." And so, boom, send tweet, and then, "Oh, you should touch grass." Like, okay. Anyway, it's been
For
a
real,
long day.
for real. It's one of those few times where that criticism of, oh, look at this second-base trad guy, but he's like living in his basement or whatever. But then you come along like, hey, I actually live this life. It's incredible. And
Yeah, so like
yeah.
when people visit me, the rule is if you can catch a chicken, you can take it home. So that's the Wolfshire rule. So if you Paul ever visit, you can. The condition though is I have to videotape you chasing the chicken, and then you can take it back to Australia when you catch it.
I
Anyway.
think I'll definitely have an ancestral advantage because my people on my mum's side, the Lebanese, we love our chicken. So I think I'm going to be especially incentivized to go get that thing.
Yeah.
And it's funny you mentioned with not expecting people to mention titles or whatever. The reason why it's funny because my own ministers at my church, they've said the same thing to me. I'm a guy, again, Lebanese heritage. We respect authority. I love to use the titles for people who actually have them. And so I'll call my ministers. I'm one of the only people in my own parish who called them ever since I first attended, Reverend, like Reverend this, Reverend that. And one of them in particular just straight up said to me, I don't want you to call me Reverend. Just call me by my name. And I'm just like, no, I don't know if I like that. But in any event, to the main topic itself. So this discussion will be, God willing, a uniquely helpful contribution for those watching. Because, of course, Dr. Wolfe, or Stephen, if you will, Steve-O in our beautiful nation of Australia, he has done plenty of talks, plenty of streams and what have you on Christian nationalism itself. And we'll give the most basic initial primer on that because that is the context of this discussion. But more specifically, we will be discussing the issue that has raised alongside the Christian nationalism debate of how to actually think through it, and the problems of a widespread modern lack of being able to think in the ways that people before the modern era or right at the start of the early modern era were able to think, because that undergirds many of the problems from what we see with many responses, many critics of Christian nationalism. And it spreads to many other issues as well, but it's been particularly pertinent here. And so in light of that issue, we'll get the groundwork, the context that prompted me to request this interview. So you would prefer Stephen, you say, or doesn't matter?
Yes, great. Yeah, I'd rather people be convinced by the argument than the title.
Of course.
That's
Hey,
my rule.
respect. I am an absolute enemy of credentialism myself. So in light of that, Stephen, could you summarize, like, very brief summary of your argument in the case for Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so I mean, the book is a long book, but the main the main argument is well, I guess you start with the definition. The simple definition is it's a Christian nation, or a nation that understands itself to be Christian. So in a sort of self-conception, says we are a Christian people, and they decide and act via law and social custom to kind of order themselves to what I call the complete good, but that also includes Christian things. So, mainly the worship of God or heavenly life. It's another way to put it is, a nation says we're Christian. Let's arrange ourselves in a way such that we order ourselves to the highest good, which is heavenly life. Now, what's involved in that is also our earthly good as well. So I don't think it's, I guess, what many people would say Gnostic, that is simply this obsession with the future state. But it's a complete good, meaning that we're seeking also material goods, strong families, the sort of temporal goods that will really make possible the type of like worship. So we can worship best on a Sunday morning when we're not afraid someone's going to steal our stuff at our house, or when we have a full belly or something like that. So there's the earthly things are supports for the highest as well. So that's the idea. It's a nation saying we're Christian people. Let's order ourselves properly to Christian ends.
Excellent. It's definitely something I, as an Anglican, discussed in the pre-show. I'm absolutely all for that, especially with the emphasis on the role of the state. But be that as it may, in light of that case, from your observation, how has it been generally received in your observation?
Yeah, on like the website Rotten Tomatoes, how occasionally there's a movie that's rated by the critics, like the top critics hate it. And so it gets the splat, but then you have the regular people who give it a popcorn, whatever the thing, or no, it's a tomato. And sometimes I sometimes feel like that, because I get a lot of positive feedback from people who don't have titles, or people who don't seminary professors, or people who don't have, don't make talking vegetables on cartoon shows and all that. I get actually very positive feedback from people. So that being said, I think there are a lot of people who are of that top critic side who just are afraid to actually praise it. But anyway, that's been kind of the response. So a lot of like the average people, they like at least like if not the arguments, like the spirit of it. They like that definition I just gave, which, yeah, like America, we want it to be a Christian people, and we should arrange ourselves properly to Christian things. People like, oh yeah, I like that idea. So but that's been the reception. Like most reviews, if you search my name, it's not all the reviews, but most reviews were negative. And very few of them, I think, were actually good reviews. But I can say that it is probably the most reviewed book. So there's a lot of books that have been reviewed like extensively. So like,
Right.
Carl Trueman writes a book and everyone reviews it and everyone praises him. He says it's great, blah, blah, blah. But how many books have been reviewed and so many of them negative? You know what I mean? So it does show that I think there's a moment here that all these people saw the need to say, wait, this could be a problem within the Reformed or the Protestant world, and so these arguments have to be kind of dealt with. And so different people from across the board, from Baptists to Presbyterians to Anglicans, reacted to it in that light. So, because it really is challenging, like my political theology, even though I don't think anything's really innovative or new. Maybe some of the way I articulate, some of the way I formulate it might be a little new. Some of the arguments might be new, but the conclusions overall are really not new. And for the most part, like I'd say 90% of my book is something, if not more, can be found within the 16th to 17th centuries within, you know, like standard names. So from Calvin to Turretin to Rutherford, all these guys, like they said, and actually many of my arguments are inspired at least from those people. So anyway, but I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I have to concur with that observation myself, and I cannot believe I didn't think of the Rotten Tomatoes analogy before you did, because that is actually spot on. It is another case of, for the large part, obviously not exact one-to-one, like every elite quote unquote hates your book and every layman loves it. But in terms of the general pattern, I have to 100% agree with that observation, because it is tapping in. It really has tapped into a colossal fracture and split between elite Christianity, so-called elite evangelical Protestant Christianity, versus that simple belief of the layman on the ground. And from what I've followed as well, we pretty much see the exact same thing with pro-life politics, where you have the elite pro-lifers who are all about the hashtag love them both the babies and the women are victims, and don't punish the women, and so basically don't make abortion a crime of murder. But then you have a ton of the ordinary pro-lifers themselves who are thinking, wait, hold up, we thought this was going to be treated as murder. So yet another example. It's really across all manners of social issues, you have that chasm of
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think what's one thing that's going on here is, and I use Aaron Rins like everyone does nowadays. Aaron Rins different worlds. He's got the positive, neutral, and negative worlds.
Yeah.
And now they're in the negative world. And even though I think he places it at 2014 or 2015, that doesn't mean everyone realized that we're in the negative world like this. But I think people are beginning to realize that we are kind of in this world where the regime or people broadly, or the elites, are hostile to Orthodox Christianity. They're not hostile to religion in general, as we saw with like that trailer that came out today with like Moore and French and
I was on
those other charlatan academics, and the vegetable guy. So they are teaming up with Rob Reiner. But so I mean, this is kind of an aside, but we shouldn't think that like the regimes against religion, or even, you know, Christian religion, they're going to use certain regime people who are willing to be kind of pawns and spokespersons for the regime to attack actually Orthodox Christianity. So, as an aside, yeah. Oh, but anyway, so the neutral negative world, within like the neutral world, that is something where, okay, well, it's not positive or negative. We don't have to be too confrontational. Like no one's claiming that men can get pregnant. Like there's some hostility, there's some degeneracy on TV shows and this and that, but we can all kind of turn those off and all that sort of thing. We can get through it. But it required a very non-confrontational approach. It didn't require Christians to say, we need to act to shore up the morality of our society, that we need to be assertive, confrontational, and willing to say, no, this is wrong. Right. We didn't, I mean, we should have even back then, but it was easier to say, okay, let's just wait it out. But now that we're in a negative world, it's like, well, what do? We're getting bombarded. But there's a lot of people, and I think Kevin DeYoung's within this camp, where they still want to remain in that neutral world posture, where we're not assertive or confrontational. We're not seeking to win within politics. We're seeking to be like, just to perhaps restore a neutral world. So I think there's like this fear that in the transition to the negative world, that Christians like myself are going to say, no, we need to actually be more confrontational. No, actually, we do need to seek to win. No, we actually have to do politics. So I mean, what is politics? Politics, I mean, you can have this sort of rosy picture of it where we all kind of collaborate, and in the end it's democracy, we all get along. Most of the time, politics is you have 50 or 60% of the majority, and that other 40%, they may not like what you as law, but it's the law. And so if Christians have a majority, in some sort of legislature and say, this is what we're going to do. Too bad, 30% people you can cry all day about it if you want, but this is right. We're going to do it. That mentality is opposed to the neutral world mentality, and it's people within the kind of the Protestant elite circles and seminary professors don't like that. So anyway, I think that's what's going on. It's like, hey, Wolfe is now writing a book that's saying these things. These have to be, and oh, by the way, they also sound like they're taken from our tradition. So these things can't be, And for
the life of me, they never.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. That for the life of me, they can never respond to that basic observation. This, as you said, and I have to agree, having not so much with the continental reform, but I'm doing a lot of deep diving these past few months just into the classical Anglican writers from the 16th up to basically the 19th, even early 20th century, across all manner of topics. And I have to concur, even for them, even though you're not specifically writing from an Anglican perspective, and you more so cite those of like the continent in your book, I have to concur. Like what you write there is more or less standard fare, and I never for the life of me ever see whether it's Owen Strachan, whether it's Josh Bice, or any of these other detractors, and not even necessarily all detractors. There can be those who are of good faith, but just those who are particularly rabid about it, and have much more of a crusader mindset. Oh well, crusader's a mean thing for them, so they probably wouldn't say that. But against your view, and yet there's just no awareness that, well, the forefathers that you, let's just be real, more or less venerate, analogous to how a Romanist or an Easterner would venerate their saints, albeit not to the same degree. They held these views that you're discussing casually, and even more so beyond that, things which could be even cancelled to an even greater degree than what you're even saying.
Yeah. So I pull from the Reformed tradition in two ways. One is early on, I say, look, I'm just going to assume some theology, because I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. And if this theology, to my knowledge, is either the majority or like the universal view of Reformed theologians for this period, I'm just going to state it. I'll list my sources. If you don't agree with it, then fine. But I'm just going to assume it, because you have to start somewhere, and at least you know what I'm assuming. It's like it's doing proper academic argumentation. But the other way is then saying, look, here's my argument for this position, like the argument for why civil government can actually can act with regard to religion, or do something with it, can make laws around sacred things, around religion. Here are my arguments. And I think I list like 9 arguments, independent arguments in the book. And I don't remember if I do it there, but what I would do then is say, look, and here's everyone else who affirm that as well. Because what would happen, I knew what would happen is that I would make an argument that I would consider sound. And instead of someone reacting, or instead of someone showing where there's a false premise or invalid reasoning, they would just freak out about the conclusion. Oh, I can't believe it. And that's generally not everyone, to be honest, but many people did exactly that. I remember very early on, like some of these guys would could do screenshots and say, look at Wolfe, said here. But a lot of those things that I said, I would then either quote or put in footnotes, well, everyone else said that too.
Yeah.
Or yes, all these other guys. So what I say is a lot of the negative reviews are in a sense like collateral damage. It's like you freak out that I conclude something. Well, that means you should freak out that like everyone else in your tradition concluded that, or not everyone, but most of these other people you venerate. That it doesn't mean I'm right, but they could be right that it's wrong. But it's just it's like one of these things where calm down, dude. Like if so many guys in your tradition affirm this as well, you can disagree all you want. There's nothing wrong with that, but calm down. Because there's collateral damage to your freak out, like your hysterics has collateral damage. So anyway, I knew it would happen and I did it. But I think there's some of the critiques are frustrating because they would say, oh, Wolfe says this, but they don't recognize that I quote Johann Alsted on that, or Althusius on that as well, or obscure figures like Heckerman, Bartholomew Heckerman, all these guys. to as well. So the conclusion is not so far out that So anyway, it's there have been good. I mean, it sounds like some of my wife's like saying you should stop saying that all the reviews are totally bad. It's like, I know you're right. Some of the reviews actually were good.
Yeah,
but most bad anyway.
Not to mention that, as you say, a lot of the positivity has come from people who aren't people with titles, let alone people with blogs or channels or what have you, where they would post these big time reviews. So even that, I guess, shouldn't necessarily be a massive surprise there. And my fellow, sorry, go.
Well, a lot of these guys where they knew, like, they venerate people like Calvin, like they like, he's one of the venerable dead, and so if I'm quoting Calvin, then they kind of attracted to this. Also, they like the spirit, the kind of the posturing of an assertive politics. It fits kind of the canon mold, except I come from things a little bit differently. But I think people like the spirit of it, and then but when they read it, they were a little confused, like, oh, he's using natural law and these other things, but they like the spirit of it. And I think that this is it's shifted the discussion where people are now seeing like the Reformed tradition in a new light through it. So that's, at least theologically, that's been a benefit for some.
Yeah, absolutely. Many people are learning for the first time that the Reformed tradition was more than just soteriology. It's much broader than just that. They actually cared for the material state of the world. Shock and horror. My Anglican friend here thinks he might get something cheeky. I will write a case for Christian Erastianism, or maybe a case for Christian empire. How do you think people will react to that?
That would be, I mean, I would disagree with it. I have my arguments against those positions, but it would certainly make the person an ally in the short run. I'm not sure as a Presbyterian how long I'd last in an Erastian state, but at least within the until we have to make that choice, then we'll become the political enemies. But in the meantime, we'll be friends.
Yeah, exactly. We'll cross that bridge when we get there, and then we'll throw.
But
in any event. But so I'm glad you gave that nice summary of the state of the critiques of your case writ large, and really just Christian nationalism at large. And that kind of gets us into, to a large degree, the cause of why so many of these critiques just kind of miss it to a massive degree, and why, as you say, they so often freak out over the conclusions, but they can't comprehend actually dealing with the premises underlying it. And even when they do attempt to go with that, they just completely miss what is the actual substance of the premise writ large. And so with that said, a question really does need to be asked then. Does your book actually fit within current categories of thought, and you're just a terrible communicator, or are you operating on just a completely different paradigm that they just don't get?
I mean, this is kind of a pre-modern modern divide. I would say, I think that I hope I'm not a bad communicator, but
I don't think so. No.
I did say in the introduction that this is going to be more of an early, like that I think like an early modern theologian or philosopher, and I write somewhat like that, I guess. And so I do think that, I was trying to think about this today as I was trying to put wood into a wood chipper. I was trying to think this through, that there is, I think, some of what people call Thomists, which there is some kind of Thomism in the book, I guess.
How dare you?
I think people just don't comprehend some of the things. So like when I think, let's just take an example like law. When like a theonomist, or a lot of people, when they think about law, they think of it purely in the sense of, well, what's righteous? Like, what's a righteous law? We should only have righteous laws. But that's the only condition. Like, that's the only condition of what laws we should have, which is just purely righteous. And they're good, and so let's just enact all the righteous laws. But I come from a perspective where, every law ought to be good in itself or righteous, but also it has to be conducive in reality for the good of people. So there are some laws that might be good in themselves, but when their effect might actually be bad. So if we want to say that, well, all instances of lying about someone else can be thrown into a court of law, and you can sue for libel, and for all sorts of lies, because, well, I mean, would that be sort of righteous law in itself? Yeah, because like lying is bad, but would it actually conduce to good in the end? So that's just an example where I think like some theonomists and others, they don't think that, like they think in terms of like this
abstractions.
Well, they don't think in like, well, the point is on the ground circumstances, how do you actually realize the good in your community? And so this is where I get accused of loving reason too much, where I'm really just saying, no, it's not just a matter of interpreting scripture and then enacting your interpretation of law. It's the concrete situation. You might say it's good to punish heretics, but if 50% of your polity are Mormons, I don't know how you're going to do that and the Commonwealth survive. So you might have to actually compromise and say, okay, 50% Mormons, we need to learn to live together, because we're not going to do a crusade and kill you all, because that'd be wrong too. So there's these considerations on the ground, concrete, that we need to consider. What is the good? What is the end towards which we're going to aim as a community? Make sure those ends are good, and then consider, well, what are the proper means to pursue that? And so it's very much like an earthly, but also on the ground analysis. And I think a lot of modern Christians don't comprehend that as much. I think that they're afraid that it's going to be socialism or something. I mean, does that make sense to you?
No, it does.
Yeah, anyway.
No, it does. It does make perfect sense, that lack of, well, when people want to make themselves sound absolutely smart and fancy, they'll say realpolitik or whatever. But just political realism, the idea that it's not, we're not working in these abstractions and that's the only way in which the world works. No, it doesn't. The world definitionally works by reality. And so, as you say, that perfect example of a law that may be good in and of itself, but if when it's put into practice, it actually brings about worse results, then that's something that perhaps should not be done. And I experienced very much the same kind of mindset of a lack of appreciation for the concrete when I do my disputes and arguments with Romanists and with Easterners, where, especially when they'll speak of, well, you Protestants, the hopelessly vague term that I absolutely hate, but you Protestants don't have the magisterium of the church, and so now you have all these endless divisions on doctrine and there's confusion and this and that. But we have perfect clarity and we have perfect unity because our abstract magisterium has made these abstract decrees about abstract doctrines, and now everything's okay. But then you actually look at the real life state of these communions, and in many ways, it's virtually identical to numerous Protestant denominations. In other cases, it's even worse. And so the lack of actually tempering one's abstract conclusions and actually putting it into application, that is, in my experience, even beyond the CN discussion, that is a very, very wide problem in the modern mindset, which is something which is something that was perfectly understood in pre-modern and early modern, and that's kind of what's making me think, well, maybe that was kind of a misnomer for this stream. It's technically more early modern, but they still carried on pre-modern thought in many ways. But that's something they understood extremely well, as you're talking about, that there is a reality we have to contend with, and we can't just say things and that represents reality.
Yeah, this was one of the, so someone will pick up my book and say, oh, Wolfe says that we should round up the heretics and kill them all.
Yeah.
And they'll point to a part in the book where I say that it's that it's permissible for a magistrate to put to death a heretic.
That's it, yeah. And that's super sorry if I may. That's the key thing to one of the most important category failures of the modern, the inability of many people today, and including detractors of CN, to distinguish between principle versus putting things into practice. Like, something may be permissible in principle, but in practice, in this context, maybe not. The complete inability, as you were just basically discussing now. So I'll let you continue. But
so they read it. I mean, there's some people who read it in bad faith and they just want to do a screenshot. But then there's other people who just don't understand the difference, or they think that I'm trying to trick them or something. When I, but anyway, I say, it's morally permissible. Here's the argument. but I say you can do other things. And then, I think that like within the Anglo-Protestant tradition, there was early on, there was a sense of, hey, we have to make sure everyone is the same, this and that. And they acted to do that, but it caused a lot of problems. And they said, well, maybe we can get along, learn to get along. And I think that was a principal development. I mean, this is one of the things in my dissertation. I try to show that actually the religious liberty of the American founding era was a culmination of Protestants saying, okay, we can get along without killing each other. I mean, that happened earlier, but I think that in that area that was, and it was principled in the sense of, like someone could say, yeah, it'd be permissible to, if like we were back in 17th century New England, where like a Quaker shows up and they're nuts, and you're like, you got to get out of here, and then they do things, but 150 years later, if somehow the Quaker calms down and they don't do blackface and wear a bag, there's some weird stuff in New England that the Quakers did. Then they did calm down, by the way. It's hilarious when people say, oh, but the poor Quakers in New England, it's like literally they were nuts. Like they were like the homeless on psychedelics or something in 17th century. But anyway, they calmed down. And so then you could then get along later on, not have to kill each other. But anyway, that's it. It's a principled development. Yep. The point being is that you can distinguish between principle or permissibility and application. It's permissible to say, stop blaspheming God, we're going to throw you in prison. And then say, well, we're kind of in a society where this is happening all the time. How are we going to implement this as a punishment within society? It's not going to work. I mean, that's an argument someone could make, but that's an argument of prudence rather than denying the principle. As someone else made this point, it was a really good point about like the modern two kingdom theology of Van Drunen, Horton, Hart, and Scott Clark, is that what they have done is they've brought what used to be like a classical twofold kingdom doctrine that had a wide latitude for prudence and action. So broad principles applied within a concrete situation. They've actually eliminated the distinction between principle and prudence, and then implemented essentially post-war principles. So now every state, like the politics of Jesus, has to be multicultural, anti-nationalist, secularist, and they actually introduced this actually more restrictive notion of what's possible within politics. And I think actually inconsistent with their tradition, but this just plays into the mentality, the modern mentality, which is that there is actually not a lot of room for prudence. Whatever you believe regarding politics is what you ought to implement or enact when you're in power. So,
yes, and when you somehow highlight an even more fundamental, that's already incredibly fundamental, the idea of the distinction between principle and practice. But even just you using the word distinction, like we distinguish this and that points to an even more fundamental problem I've been seeing. I'd love to see your take on just a lack of ability to make distinctions, period. The lacking ability or the lack of effort to see what someone's saying and not just impute your own preconceived modern idea of it, but be willing to tap the brakes and say, well, okay, hang on, what does he mean by this? Does he mean this distinct idea? Does he mean this one? And then appreciating, well, when I say this, I distinguish this from that. And so when I say this, I'm not saying that. Like, case in point, when you're saying, as you were just talking about, when you're saying that there should be a Christian nation that's self-consciously Christian, and the government should govern in order to maintain and enforce, in some respect, that end. That's not the same thing. That is a very distinct idea. It can include that, but it's not coextensive with the idea of rounding up the heretics and massacring them all. So would you agree? I mean, you probably do, I guess, but would you agree? And would you highlight maybe some other examples, if you do agree, of just the lacking ability in many of these detractors in just being able to make distinctions?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, several times when it comes to kind of suppressing or restraining false religion, several times I make the point that that no civil action against a heretic or a blasphemer can actually change the heart of that person. And actually the end or the purpose is not that, because you don't have the, it makes no sense to seek an end you have no means to achieve, right? So civil power does not possess the sort of power to force one to deny or affirm the opposite of what they're affirming. But they can say outwardly, you can't say this or you can't say that. And if you do say this or you say that, then you're going to be punished in some regard. So the application is outward, which is once you verbalize a belief, it becomes outward, and that can be then restrained. And the purpose of it can be a lot of things, and not those things would not include you trying to change their heart or punishing them simply for having a false belief or an errant belief. That it could be something like you're going to potentially harm the souls of others within society. It could be that it's subversive of society. So take like in New England, people say, "Oh, that what they did to the poor Baptists in New England in 17th century." Well, the Baptists would show up and say, "None of you are truly baptized. You don't have a Christian king or a Christian magistrate. Your churches aren't even so many of them would say you don't even have real churches." And so that sounds pretty subversive, pretty much saying that this Christian colony that was founded a couple decades earlier, you show up to then basically say that no one's a Christian or no one is a gospel minister or this and that. Well, that you can see why, maybe a kind of a fledgling colony of Congregationalists wouldn't appreciate that. And so they would suppress the Baptists in that situation. Now, 100 years later, there's so much diversity already that a Baptist showing up and saying, your magistrate's not Christian, like, okay, whatever, you're nutty. They wouldn't have to act against it. But the point being is that, it could be protect the souls of the people. And that's akin to, like, I know this is maybe a silly it's an analogous case. It's not an example of them. But like noise ordinances, you think about, like, you're not supposed to drive around a neighborhood and have it cranked up to max because it's a nuisance. It's not harming you physically to hear some dude like bumping his subwoofer, but it's psychologically and it's unpleasant. And so that's the sort of thing, like, you can't do that. That's a case of the civil rulers saying that action harms people internally, psychologically. It disrupts this and that, so it can be suppressed. So along similar lines, in an analogous sense, you could say that that heresy can disrupt the good of someone with regard to spiritual good. But it could be, like I said, subversion and other things as well. So
so numerous lines of distinguishing public piety versus private piety, distinguishing basically, well, just take your pick, everything you discussed there. All in all, just being able to crystallize what you're talking about, have a definite form to it, and then be able to put it over here, and then take something else which maybe uses similar terminology but is nonetheless different, and then put it over here and being able to talk about them separately. Something being able to do that is really one of the most essential keys, from what you're saying. One of the most essential keys, being able to understand all this stuff.
And one of my pet peeves is when people say, "Well, the church ought to do this, and the church should not do that." Like,
we agree.
Okay, but what do you mean by church? Like, there can be the church as in all people on earth. There could be the church as an institution that has kind of the ordinance of the word sacrament. And in that case, like, is it the mission of the church as institution to bring about Christian civil order? I would say no. Like, but I would say no, it's not. So is it the mission of the instituted church is principally going to be administering the things of heavenly life or eternal life that orient people heavenward? Now, that doesn't mean they don't have they have some role with regard to earthly things, but that's their principal role. But Christians as a people, which you could say that, like, the people in a civil sense are coextensive with the ecclesial sense. This would be a good Anglican point, right? That the ecclesial sphere and the civil sphere are distinguished but have the same people. You know, like that's what the ideal Anglican state would be, that everyone is in the same church and the same state. Nevertheless, in two different administrations.
Yep.
The point being is that the Christians, in a sense, outside of that ecclesial sphere, are the ones who are then going to do this sort of agonistic struggle to create a Christian civil order. Now, the church kind of supports that, but then the people, the church as the people of God, then are the ones who would have to arrange themselves. And that's why you don't have the minister, the church minister, as the civil ruler. Like he's the church minister. You should have a separate civil leader. So anyway, the point being is there's that distinction that people don't make. It's very imprecise. And what tends to happen is, okay, the mission church is this, and that tends to broaden out such that now you and I and other people within our respective nations cannot seek to have a Christian civil order, because you've conflated essentially something that should be distinguished.
Yeah, completely true. And what's hilarious is that actually that question of what is the role of the church in relation to the state, that was a very active question with the Reformation, particularly against the Church of Rome, because they had their whole concept of the spiritual is greater than the temporal. And in some very extremely loose sense, that's pretty much what the anti-Christian nationalists today are saying, but just in a completely warped sense, because even with the papists, even though they claim like the church is superior to the state, therefore that's why we have a pope who can basically enthrone and dethrone emperors and kings at will. But even with that, their argument was never that the state doesn't have an interest or a role in maintaining true Christian religion. The opposite, the state was the church's instrument to enforce true religion. But nonetheless, that was a debate in the Reformation. And it's in response to that you get authors like John Jewell, who will just straight up say, without blinking twice, because there was really no contest to it, at least within the mainstream, who will just say without blinking twice, well, no, the best commonwealths in human history from Israel to the present have all had it where the state had that key central governing role over like the state of worship within its own boundaries. And so it becomes an even greater danger, in my opinion, where if someone can't make such basic distinctions as you mentioned, of, well, what do you mean by the church, and what is this particular definition of the church? What is its role in relation to the state, in relation to the people, and what have you? If you can't even make those basic distinctions, then you're just not going to be able to comprehend Reformation history.
Yeah. I don't know so I was never formally trained as a theologian, but I get the sense that in a lot of Reformed seminaries, or I guess conservative Protestant seminaries, that this isn't really taught. I don't know. Perhaps I'm wrong, but that could be changing. But I get the sense that a lot of people graduate from seminary, and people graduate and have PhDs, and they really are not equipped to think along these lines. I think sometimes it's like the Biblicist side, where they're really they're really kind of nervous when it comes to like rational argumentation. They want everything to be conform almost word to word from Scripture, and not think in terms of systematics and logical necessity, and making these distinctions to make things actually coherent, to make it work. Like, okay, you don't want to be Roman Catholic, you don't want to be, whatever, Nestorian, you don't want to be Arian, you don't want to be this and that. And in order to kind of work out your theology, you're going to have to say, well, we need to distinguish this and that. Like, we have to. So, but there's just not that sense of urgency to do that. Perhaps I'm wrong, but that's just my impression over the last, year or so.
Yeah, I haven't gone to a Reformed seminary myself, but being in those circles only until recently, and only with certain people, I'd agree that hasn't been that great of a priority. And something great along that lines. I'm glad you brought up Biblicism, so I want to tap on that a bit as well. But just before we do, a reminder, people, we'll be having a Q&A at the end of this, and so if you are a supporter on Locals, or if you give through Super Chat, your questions will have priority. But otherwise, we'll try to get to everyone, insofar as we have the time to do so. Do you have a time limit today, Stephen, or?
No, I don't think so.
All right, sweet.
My
And
kids might be watching Home Alone 2, so I do want to see the Trump cameo in that. So if we could end it before that, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Actually, my kids are like, we want to watch Home Alone, and like, no, and then like Home Alone 2 is like, well, no, Trump's in that. I have to. You can't watch
Home Alone 2. It's actually the Trump prequel, guys. Come on. But in any event, so people getting those questions for Q&A, we will be discussing them at the end. But in light of that, what you mentioned there with Biblicism, I'm really glad you brought it up. That seems to be another major paradigmatic hindrance with how people respond to the issue of CN today versus how pre-modern and early modern / reformational figures thought, even though they were avowedly for the principles of the supremacy of Scripture, that Scripture alone cannot err. But they weren't biblicists in what we see with a number of people. So could you describe what you've observed with CN critics who employ the negative sense of biblicism in their responses, and could you contrast that to what you've seen with Reformation traditions and how they think?
Yeah, so I mean, I come from, I guess, start from the second part. I see in a lot of early moderns, but specifically like in 17th century, a desire to distinguish disciplines. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see a distinction between theology and ethics and politics and economics, meaning home economics. And so you'll actually see these things in order. You'll see some guy write something on ethics, like he does an ethical, like a treatise on ethics, and then he'll do economics, and then he'll do politics. And these are considered the practical philosophy. And so they're distinguished different disciplines from actually theology. Now they all overlap and they're related to one another. You can put them in hierarchical order if you want, but there's a sense in which if you're studying politics, that's what you're studying. And you can import, like, you need ethics to do politics, you need theology to do politics, but you're still treating as a kind of a separate discipline. And so from when I then approach politics in the book, even though I bring in theology, theological anthropology, other things, I treat it as, for the most part, it's a little fuzzy, but for the most part as political philosophy, or as just politics in the classical or early modern sense. But people don't comprehend that. They, in a biblicist mind, like every single discipline, for the most part, other than, I guess, being a plumber, electrician, but anything that you want to put into what traditionally be a philosophy, has to then be something purely derived from a sort of biblical exegesis, which means ultimately that all those disciplines have to then be studied by essentially a theologian. So the theologian or the pastor then is the one that studies all these things and writes about, because they're the experts on Scripture. And that's the tendency you see among biblicists today, or a lot of Christians today, is that they expect theologians and pastors to be the principal source of all those what was once distinguished as disciplines. I approach it, like I said, differently. And so I think that politics should be politics, ethics should be ethics, and theology should be theology. And I think that's the classical view. I mean, meaning the classical Protestant view, even though that's not to say that theologians can't write on politics or write on ethics. But when they do these things, they're writing as ethicists or as political scientists or something like that, or political theorists. So, anyway. So, I mean, you could just look up, they're not translated, but Johann Alsted was a early 17th century kind of Plymouth. Like, he understood, like, is pretty impressive what he knew. And he... he would treat these in different disciplines, but even though he was trained as a theologian. So anyway, that's my perspective. I think sometimes, like, the problem with biblicism, and I got beat up on Twitter maybe a month or two ago because I said something to the effect of, like, there needs to be fewer theologians in studying politics or writing about politics. And, like, people really react. And that was, I think, the biblicism is like, well, politics has to be a theologian's thing. Whereas, yeah, you can have political scientists, but they study like comparative politics and compare this and that. They don't actually do politics as a philosophy, as a normative study.
Mm.
But yeah, that's Biblicism. So
Yeah. And I even in retrospect, because I was first a while, years, we're talking like probably back in 2017, 2018. So when I was around 17, 18 myself, my friend first introduced me to the Reconstructionists and Rushdoony and what have you. And I see in them, and in retrospect, I see really in this sense of Biblicism, the idea of every field is fundamentally, you must, not that anyone in our spheres denies that theology is a fundamental in that sense. Like you'll have the scary Thomists themselves who will say that theology is the queen of the sciences, and there's a good reason for that, because everything's from God and theology directly pertains to God. And so there's no dispute that theology is, in a sense, the fundamental basis of all these things. But that's not the same as making it the exclusive or the overwhelming domain in which politics and other things are studied. And in retrospect, looking at these Reconstructionists, that's pretty much exactly what they do. Where you'll have, like, say, Gary North or whatever, and he'll try to argue that everything we believe, from like economics to even mathematics, it's rooted in the Bible and like the 5 books of Moses, and you must derive it from there. And likewise, certain ideas of like hardcore pre-sup apologetics. And
yeah, I mean, economics, like that's a great example where because classical economics, so like you don't see a lot of like Adam Smith's citing scripture, Wealth of Nations. What is he doing? He observed the marketplace of London and England, and he probably traveled in France as well, and he saw these things, and he wrote a book on economics. And but yeah, I find it just completely absurd that, like, in order to have an opinion on economics, you have to essentially do chapter and verse. But I mean, you mentioned Rushdoony, the Reconstructionists. I think this is another example where, now, instead of law being a domain of legal philosophers, of jurists, of lawyers, of judges, where it was for most of church history, and they brought that into, now it's a theologian's thing. Like now the theologian is the legal theorist, as opposed to there being a legal theorist that's separate from the theologian. And that's just a continuation of the same theme, like as I've said before.
Yeah, that's complete truth to that. And with me, when I had for a long time kind of assumed that kind of a biblicist thing, and again, for people watching as well, to exercise some of what we've been saying here, the ability to make distinctions, which is how you can understand these things. We're going to distinguish what we're calling biblicism here, the idea of making the Bible or theology, that it has a monopoly on all other areas of study. That's what we're talking about here. And that's not whether you agree with it or not, that's not a early modern or pre-modern / reformational way of viewing these things. That's distinct from principles like sola scriptura, which I 100% affirm. Stephen's a Presbyterian, for crying out loud, so come on, he's not exactly swimming the Tiber here. So it's necessary to distinguish those things one from another. And I think I somehow lost my train of thought from that, but it was basically along that line of, like, look, you got to, everyone watching, you got to make sure you distinguish those things. And that's what I was going to say. I'd assumed a biblicist mindset, that kind of a biblicist mindset, defined that way, for the greatest time, until only recent years. And so whenever I'd read figures like church fathers or reformers, and I'd see them citing scripture on one hand, but then I'd see them make these claims like, oh, well, it's obvious that this, or it's obvious that, from nature or from what we observe, whatever. And I just kind of, my eyes would kind of roll over like, oh, he's not basing that on scripture. Oh, that's just fallible human reasoning. But then now that I've actually decided to take these things more seriously, it's like, no, these are looking at reality as it is without having a Bible in your hand. That's how we live. We observe the world, and we can make observations with the greatest of moral certainty that it just can't be wrong, and we can make conclusions of that. And that's how pretty much everyone before a century or so ago, or at least whenever I don't know, certain kinds of Anabaptists raised up. That's how, well, not even then. I won't even say that about them necessarily, but that's how everyone before very recently thought. Like, yeah, the Bible's supreme, but we can also see truth elsewhere.
Yeah, because I mean, prior to Scripture, there was a law, and that law remained and remains operative in fallen man. So yeah, like sometimes people like the Biblicists, they sound as if prior to there being like Scripture, there you simply could not even know or have some sense of what you ought to do in these different moral in these different situations. But I mean, so take like I can't believe I mentioned Johann Alsted 3 times in this, but he has a quote in there where he says on political, he's talking about political matters, but he said, but you could apply this to ethics as well, and like home economics. But it would be, he says, reason dictates, experience confirms, Scripture convinces. And it's not with regard to theology, like that is like revealed theology, because you don't start with reason with revealed theology, but the idea for these other matters that are actually earthly, very kind of fundamentally human questions and disciplines, or the questions of practical philosophy. It's reason, as in you consider the nature of things in themselves, and these kind of dictate. And so, like you said, like you'll read something and it'll say, well, nature dictates. Like you'll see this from Calvin, like people say this, and then you'll hear other people say, well, the consent of the nations is this, and that points to, have you heard of that sort of language before? Like the consent of the nations, meaning that the nations of history have all affirmed that murder is wrong, or they've all affirmed that government should have a role in religion. Like that's actually a very common argument. They'd cite Plato, they'd cite Cicero, they'd cite Aristotle, and say, look, the nation. So experience then confirms. So reason, you have a suspicion from reason, I guess you could say. And then you look in the world and say, okay, well, now the experience of the world, your own experience of other people's confirms. And then Scripture convinces you of that as like a third category. So that's I think that's one way to think about it. But really the point is, though, that when we make decisions in ethics, in politics, not in theology, but in ethics and politics, the decision of what to do in this case or that case is not a matter of some universally applied principle, or not even principle, but law. It's in that situation you have to make a decision of what to do, and sometimes there's competing goods. If you go this way, you're going to sacrifice one set of goods. If you go the other way, you're going to sacrifice this other set of goods. So it's on the ground making these decisions, and it's not as easy as simply applying some exegetical conclusion in situations. So same thing as like civil law and the way you order a household. You make decisions, economic decisions all the time. Well, we really want to support that missions trip from those high schoolers that want to go to, Ukraine or something like that, or wherever. But you know what? We actually are going to starve if we do that. So you make an ethical decision and say, we can't support these kids who really want to have a free week in Eastern Europe. So we're going to feed ourselves instead. There's decisions that we make of competing goods. That's good, this good, and we make a decision on it. So anyway. Rant complete, I guess. I don't know what I'm ranting against, but
no, it's not even if that's a rant, I'd hate to see you
keep
actually angry.
I have to tell myself, okay, it's time to stop.
True. So I think we've covered a lot of really, really good ground there of just how did those classical reformers and really just people pre 19th, 20th century in general thought on these matters, particularly with respect to political theology, although definitely with ramifications across really almost all areas of thought that have been affected by the late modern age. And so in light of all that, could you give some basic tips, basic advice, whether theoretical or practical, on how lay people following these debates, how they themselves can develop such an ability to appreciate when another person or another text is operating from a very different worldview, and not just assume, and how to discern that, how that worldview works, and not just assume what they themselves already understand.
Yeah. I guess like my first thought is that, well, make sure you take a logic class when you're in high school or college. That is like a classical propositional logic. You don't want to some of those other weird stuff, but at the basic of that, I think, well, I should say that we should demand that people demonstrate their conclusions.
Mm.
They should be upfront about this. Is sometimes like my writing can be more dry just because I have this commitment to saying, this is what I'm trying to prove. Here are my assumptions. Here's my premises. Here's my conclusion. Here's how I get to that conclusion. I think we should demand, like, people can be better writers than me and still do that. I think we should demand that people, when they try to make an argument for something, they should actually demonstrate it. And when they do it, when they're doing it in an opposing way, saying, I disagree with this person, you should make sure up front that you understand precisely what the issue is. So if you're trying to prove to me that civil government should not act against false religion, or can't in principle, and you're saying, well, because Wolfe believes that you should punish someone simply for having a false belief, for no other reason than having a false belief. That will, if you think that's what I believe, then you've misunderstood the question, or the question is bad, because so in other words, I'm going to probably end up agreeing with your conclusion, because I too do not believe that simply because in some dude's head he affirms something that we should go throw him in prison. I believe that in principle it would be wrong, not just in matter of prudence. So anyway, so I think that's it. So if you're going to oppose something, understand precisely what the issue is. And a lot of times, like, I'm sure you've been in debates, and a lot of times, like, up front, a lot of your debate is trying to figure out where you actually disagree. You know what I mean? Like, you are constantly trying to think, okay, wait, no, I agree with that. Okay, well, then what precisely is that question where we disagree? And go from there. So figure out what that question is. And the early modern people were so good at doing this. I love Francis Turretin, and he does that. Like, has a question, and he boils down that question to what he thinks is the issue between him and his opponents.
Yeah, with his initial questions of, like, the question is not this, it's not this, it's not this, it is this. That's brilliant how he does that.
Yeah, and I think that's why, in a few times in the book, I'll do that, where it's not this, not that. I'm trying to head off what I think some people commonly believe would be the question. And then once you get down to what that question is, and you want the question to be not like, it's a sort of question where you and your interlocutor would agree that that's the question. Sometimes you can frame a question as,
when did you stop
being
beating
something
your wife?
where you sort of
you can have bad questions like that. When did you stop beating your wife? You can have bad questions of that nature.
Sort of loaded question, or it could be, anyway. So that's one thing. I don't know if that's very helpful to people.
No, it is. No, it is.
I think being like sensitive to distinctions, demanding distinctions, understand the difference between, like, distinguishing something and separating something. So, like, the two kingdom theology, sometimes people misunderstand that, like, two kingdoms is kind of really a distinction rather than a separation, at least in my view. And where it is a sort of twofold kingdom in the singular with two modes of reign. I don't know what Anglicans think about. Sometimes Anglicans, I'm not sure what they think on that. I do in my book argue against Erastianism, if you may notice. But I don't think any Anglican has actually addressed. Maybe they're bad arguments and they're not worth their time. But anyways, I basically say, I don't know if we're going to get into like an anti-Anglican thing, but I basically say that the old two kingdoms approach of Anglicans leads you logically to affirm two distinct churches, meaning the invisible and the visible have to be distinct two churches, which is false because there's only one church. But anyway, we don't have to get into that. Maybe we can do a debate someday.
Yeah, maybe one day. Hey, that'd be a fun one. Why not?
Yeah, I'd love to discuss that more because I could be wrong on an argument. But anyway, how did I get onto that? Anyway, I'm trying to get an Anglican to debate me.
Your Presby Scott blood is kind of showing up, unfortunately.
Blood, yeah. I'm actually more English than Scottish, but you know that there were English Presbyterians too back in the day.
Of course, yeah. That fateful period with the Westminster Parliament, that time that shall not be named. But maybe we'll have that debate one day. And in fairness, I'm still exploring that politically, although I am more or less sympathetic to major elements of Erastianism. Although from what I've read in secondary sources, I haven't read primary, so I can't say for absolute certain, but I have heard that the guy himself, Erastus, I assume that's his name, that he actually even opposed the idea of the church being able to excommunicate in its own right, which is, if that's true, that's just kind of, that's stupid. But in any event, with all that said, that is genuinely good advice. So I can concur with on how people can actually start to engage in these debates and start to try to think clearly. And I can 100% attest, even myself, that when I started to first read these, just these pre-modern era authors, like whether it be classical reformers or even church fathers, but particularly the classical reformers, and the Anglican authors, of course, that even just reading them and appreciating what they say, that alone has affected in me that greater and greater sensitivity to careful thinking and careful argumentation, because it's basically a live demonstration of how to do that. And once you take it seriously and you're not freaking out about what they say, you just read them. It gives you a live demonstration of, here's how to argue with precision, here's how to think clearly, here's how to distinguish things. And so I can definitely concur and just add to what you say, just reading them just reading them will be of massive benefit to your ways of thinking. And so in light of that reality, obviously there's literally infinite sources with this. Any source from the classical Reformation or pre-modern era will be relevant. And so I guess specifically with respect to political theology or politics writ large, what classical Reformation or pre-modern sources would you recommend to people in order to best come to an understanding of Reformation political thought?
Yeah, sorry, I just got a Charlie horse in my leg. I literally spent like 10 hours a day outside doing a lot of manual labor. So I apologize if all of a sudden I went down and tried to, but yeah, it's still there. But I can, this will be a test if I can think and feel pain at the same time. No, but so I think, one thing would be, even though like Turretin, like a good theologian, doesn't speak on politics that much. He does actually have a good section on the relationship of church and state in that. But reading someone like him, even on theology, just makes you a better thinker. That's what I love about it. Even though I like reading, even if I tend to read things that are more relevant to theology or politics, because that's what I do. But when I like to read Turretin even on things that are less relevant, politics, just because of the way he thinks, makes you think better. His method. So that's one. I think reading people like Johannes Althusius, his book Politica, is a good book on politics. Rutherford's Lex Rex it's a difficult read, but it's a very good a good read. What's that?
I love that one when I got it.
Yeah. It's I've heard like it's challenging, but because his writing style is kind of odd, but it seems like it almost feels like it's a stream of consciousness type writer. just kind of so I think those guys are in the pre-modern area are going to be really good for that.
Excellent. And so I think in light of that, actually, Michael Hale here concurs. A debate would be fun. So there you go. In fairness, it's not like I've just said, oh, I'm an Anglican, therefore I must adopt Erastianism. It's something I'm still looking at. I'm very sympathetic with certain elements of it, but I'm also more so, I guess we're more closely, like I recognize the reality that there are numerous legitimate church institutions, and so maybe I wouldn't endorse like a church state per se, but still I would believe nonetheless the state, in order for it to interact with Christianity, it would have to enforce a definition of Christianity, and so in effect create some sense of a state church or confederation of state churches. So it would functionally still be kind of the same, but in any event, we'll get to that debate when we get there. And so in light of all that, that is, ladies and gentlemen, that is our main part of the discussion done. I think, God willing, everyone who's watched here has come out even more intelligent and is able to move forward into more reading on these issues if you are actually interested in it and want to have some serious meaty interaction with current issues of Christian nationalism and just Christianity and politics more generally, and even beyond that, being able to think, just be able to think more clearly and not assume current trends in thought, and be able to interrogate ideas with precision and with charity. And so, Dr. Wolfe, thank you so much for that epic presentation, for your awesome answers that you've given today.
Yeah, no problem. I thought we were going to take questions. Isn't it?
Like, no, we are. I was saying thank you.
This is about the money making time, right?
Money. No.
That's why I'm here. You do the full hour. I
was just saying. Okay, you got to distinguish.
No,
Mr.
yeah,
Wolfe.
okay, you got to distinguish. Yeah, don't separate.
Distinguish between a final goodbye versus a thank you for the main part.
I like live questions because you never know what you're going to get, and there's always something.
We got some fun ones. I'll tell you that one in particular. I'm thinking of. We'll get to eventually. Maybe you've seen.
Well, do you guys have that phrase Charlie horse in Australia? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't think we do, or if we do,
it's where your hamstring. It's where your hamstring wants to break or tighten so much it feels like it's going to break.
Okay, yeah, I've felt that sometimes.
That's what it is, and it's very unpleasant. But I can still answer questions. This is like a Bene Gesserit test or something.
Oh, the Jesuits, those who shall not be named, those who actually caused the Enlightenment. But that's another topic for another time. But in any case, Samuel with 20, is that pounds or euros? I think that's euros. Yeah, I think that's euros. But
I think I know.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much for that epic super chat, man. One of Stephen's articles I read was on evangelical ethics as justification of moral reactions, which was very insightful. Are there any pre-20th century sources he'd recommend to learn to think properly about ethics?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's what's his name, Laplace or de Laplace. He just a book just came out on moral philosophy. I think it's on moral philosophy. I think it's de Laplace. So Place. That's kind of it's probably an inexpensive, maybe 15. So it's that's like he's like a 16th century reformed guy. Hopefully that helps. And he distinguishes theology and ethics in that book as well. If something else comes to mind as well. Hemmingson, Niels Hemmingson. He's a Lutheran from 16th century. So Hemmingson, I think. He wrote a book on the moral virtues. And there might be others I can't think of the top of my head right now.
Excellent. Okay.
You could read Kant's moral philosophy.
You what, mate? Did you just what? Did you just say that name on this channel? I'm going to get Dr. Jordan Cooper on you. But in any event, Stephen has just kind of answered the question I was going to ask. How could the books... Okay, about how could the book's theories be adapted to other countries?
Yeah. So I am an American, so there might be premises in there that I think are obvious that only an American would think are obvious. But for the first 9 chapters, I really don't mention the United States much at all. So it is broadly speaking, a political theory that would be universally applicable. And what this means is that I don't have a blueprint. So I don't have a blueprint that would be, this is what a Christian society ought to look like in the particulars. And so in that sense, at least according to my own view, it could be applicable anywhere, which means that you could, I know there's debates about, I guess I'm kind of a moderate Presbyterian where I think that like the actual church polity can be different in different places, and I'm okay with that. I'm not like a, you know, strict Presbyterian in that regard. So in different places you can have, like Hungary had a Reformed church that was actually Episcopal in for the most part. Then that's fine. Same thing with England. They can have a king over the church or whatever however they want to do that. If they want, just leave me out of it. But anyway, the point being is you can have you can have these different arrangements that are consistent with the principles. So yeah, and that really speaks to how this is, why this is a sort of nationalism. I know people don't like the term. We haven't talked about that, but it's a matter of like, there's a nation. What is a nation? And then the ism of the nation is saying, okay, we as a people are going to seek our good in the ways that we culturally, historically understand ourselves to be, in line with the gospel and to that end. But that's why you get very different peoples in different places.
Indeed. And it really is just the basic premise of, is a nation merely a collective of individuals who are gathered by the mere happenstance of historical contingencies? Or is a nation a real entity that can be said to have interests and qualities and what have you? And if you affirm the latter, then basically every basic idea of quote unquote nationalism more or less follows from that. Because if you affirm that a human individual is a real individual with interests, and there's natural good of preservation and caring for yourself in a material sense before you care for others, the same would follow for nations, basically, with respect to other nations.
Yeah, and that's common political philosophy, and I say the same thing in the book. I just read that in what's his name, Vattel, who was a kind of legal political theorist. He just said that exactly in the beginning of, where is it? It's somewhere up here. But yeah, that's very, so yeah, like the idea that you could have an individual as a moral entity, and that individual has self-interest, meaning that they seek after their own good. The good, like the classical people freak out about this in modern evangelicalism, but classically, this goes back to Augustine. Like in a sense, your first duty is to God, but you, in terms of like the acting for good, it's actually for your own individual good. And because basically the idea is that you're worthless to others if you're not actually yourself fit and healthy. And what good are you to your family if you're starving yourself because you're giving food to the poor or something like that? You yourself have to be an object of love primarily, such so that you can be in service to others. But anyway, the idea that the nation, like you said, a nation as a moral entity has firstly its obligation to itself. And Vattel wants to say, okay, well then now the nation has obligations to other nations as well. And he brings it into an international relations theory. But anyway, but yeah, that's right. But yeah, if you believe that nations are like real entities, real moral entities, which I think scriptural, it's obvious. It's very common to believe this in the past, in Western canon of political thought. If that's the case, then what is nationalism? Separated from the baddies of the last 100 years, what is nationalism except that entity saying we're going to arrange ourselves for our good, right? So that's how I define it. Anyway.
Yep, very true. I 100% agree. And we have just gotten 2 super chats from Redeem Zoomer. My man is in the chat here. 2 $5 super chats. Thanks a ton for coming, man. And with that, he has given a question. What do you think of retaking the mainline Protestant churches, Stephen?
So I have not read his article. I listened briefly to his. He's
given another $5 to say it again.
Thanks. The space on that, and I haven't. To be honest, I know you paid money, so you want like a brilliant answer. I haven't thought a lot about it, but my thinking is that I have 4 kids and a wife, and they are my first. I have a greater duty to them than I do to a nice building with an endowment or something like that downtown.
Zoom's not gonna like
Maybe
that.
that's not a fair characterization. So I apologize if that's the case. But if I were, let me put it this way, if I were, and it's not a knock up against people who are single, if I were single, then yeah, okay. I mean, go ahead and do that. Because you yourself can protect yourself. But I have 4 kids and a wife, and so I'm going to go to the best church that is there. So that's my and that follows from the principle of they are my first duty over other considerations. It's a matter of competing goods, like I mentioned earlier. I understand it, like there might be a good in kind of retaking the mainline. I myself want a Protestant. I would like to see the recovery of an assertive, established Protestantism, because that was our country for up until maybe the 40s and 60s or the 60s until that was essentially relinquished.
Established, you said. Established, well, you said. Racianism confirmed.
Yeah. Informally. Well, I mean, I'm okay with establishment in principle too, but but not over the. Anyway, you know what I mean. That's my thinking. Because it's a matter of competing goods and priorities, and so that's the decision. But I'm not against in principle someone wanting to do that. I understand the desire. I kind of get angry every time I drive down a street and I see this beautiful or like nice church, and then you see the Peace USA sign on it. Like, well, darn.
It's kind of like,
or it says First Presbyterian. Like, okay, well, yeah, you're heretical or whatever. So
it's kind of like you have this beautiful Mona Lisa, and then in one corner is just a section of Picasso. It's just a stain on the whole thing. But thank you so much for that question, Zima. Redoom Zima. That's kind of the classic going around now. But thank you for your support, you absolute legend. Keen to talk with you more. And we have another question, very interesting one here from Stephen Smith for £5. Thank you very much. Detractors claim you argue in CN that an interracial marriage could be a sin. I didn't find this when reading. Is it in there? Could you please unpack? Spicy one.
Yeah, it is not in there. Actually, the opposite is stated in there. I don't say interracial marriage. I don't say it's not a sin or it's good in itself. But I do say at a point that if you're that one of the goods of marriage, and this comes from Aristotle, is that it unites people together. So if you have competing, or if you have different clans and they intermarry, what do? Well, they essentially become kind of one people. You see this. You could just read Livy's Histories of Rome. This sort of intermingling happened that created the Roman people early on, until they became an empire and all that. But that's you see this intermingling. You see early signs of that in the end of the Aeneid. There's this kind of intermarrying. And that's what I was getting at. But I've never said anything against interracial marriage as being a sin. I do not believe that interracial marriage is a sin. So. I've never said anything to that effect. I have said, to be clear, and it's something that I essentially I guess retracted just because it wasn't very clear what I was trying to get at. I did say that in a sense, like inter-ethnic marriage, by which I distinguish something like racial, can be like I think it's the problem when we hold it up as being this great sign of the gospel, because I think it's good that you would transmit good traditions to your children, and usually that happens when you marry people of the same ethnicity. But ethnicity essentially meaning a sort of culture that's historically grounded, to put it broadly as I define it. Yeah. So there is something good about, like, if you want to preserve a people that have a particular way of life. If that is kind of the goal of the nation, then generally speaking, people would have to kind of intermarry or they have to marry within their own people. Yep. And if there's massive inter-ethnic marriage, that can actually disrupt a way of life and do harm to it. And at the same time, it can also be a sort of ethnogenesis, where you create a new ethnicity with that intermarriage. But that's the sort of thinking I was thinking, because again, as I said, like early in the program, when I'm thinking about like what I'm not thinking of just pure abstract like propositions of what's moral and what's not. Yeah. It's a question of on the ground, what on the ground with the people in reality is good and what's not good. So people can disagree, but it just seems to me that if I married someone of a wildly different culture, what you transmit to kids would have to be seriously negotiated. Like you'd have to understand. I mean, and sometimes this happens naturally, but anyway, that was my point. And but to say directly, no, I don't think interracial marriage is a sin. So
yeah, exactly.
hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, to be
well, you said you're half Lebanese, is that right?
Half Lebanese myself, exactly. Half Lebanese.
So
here's the funny thing: half Lebanese. My mum and her family are I guess preemptive refugees. They left Lebanon just before the civil war broke out because my mum's dad saw it was coming. So it was kind of like a preemptive refugee thing, if you will, from Lebanon. And my dad's side is Whitey McWhiteface all the way back to the First Fleet. So that's a mix and a half right there. And I thank God that my Lebanese genes have won out in many respects here. But in any event, in any event, yeah, I have to agree with that. Like, obviously, to be blunt, people who can think clearly about these issues, they can understand the distinction between whether something is or is not sin in principle versus in practice with certain things. And so obviously, and then in fairness, there can be honest people who are just nonetheless so imbibed in the zeitgeist that they could read that infamous tweet of yours and think, no idea. But otherwise, people who have the clear thinking will be able to see, well, he's not saying it's a thing in principle. It can be in situations a matter of practice. And I guess hitch my wagon with you in defense. I agree that, especially here in Australia, because we do have a mass immigration problem here. I think it can be in situations with respect to the mass loss in many areas of real Anglo-Australian identity. That people who go out of their way, like if there's people who go out of their way to marry someone who's not of that, to kind of keep it as vague as possible, that definitely can be a sinful thing. I'd concur with that. And that's something that's just assumed even in Lebanese and widely Eastern cultures, that all else being equal, you should be trying to preserve your people and keep continuing that. And so it will be a heavily scrutinized thing if a Lebanese suddenly goes out and marries someone of a completely foreign people. It's something that was just assumed in a broadly pre-modern worldview, and there's nothing wrong with that, because Galatians 3:28 doesn't address this question. The idea that we're one in Christ with respect to salvation and our union with Christ doesn't address the question of, well, okay, how do these different peoples relate to each other in practical reality? That's a unfortunate issue. Many people can't think through.
Well, I mean, it actually goes back to the distinction question. So when they see, okay, Wolfe's against interracial or interethnic marriage, he thinks it's a sin. They think in these absolute terms, where now he goes and he sees an Indian marrying an Anglo girl or something and think, oh, that's sinful or whatever, that's wrong, when that's not at all what I was trying to get at. And one of the issues, like that tweet is so old now, but one of the reasons I kind of retract, even though I like you said, I think there is a legitimate consideration of cultural preservation.
Yep.
And marriage is such an important ground of transmission of culture. Yep. So it is a legitimate issue or question. I think a legitimate conclusion. What I didn't like, in retrospect, like when I thought about it, what I didn't like about this statement was that I used the word sin.
Yeah. Because
the problem with sin is like, well, if I'm talking at the community level, like, well, who sinned? Like the nation, the community. It was one of these things where it sounded like, okay, well now, like, so who's doing the repenting? Does the nation have to repent because they married too many people not of their own? That was the problem, and that's where I think the tweet is a bad tweet.
Yeah, lack of clarity.
But the question of what is the role of marriage with regard to cultural preservation is a legitimate question.
Yeah.
And I think most peoples, like in the world, understand exactly probably what I was getting. They wouldn't be as offended. They might not like the sin word, but they'd get the idea that, yeah, obviously if you all intermarried out, like you'd lose something. So
they'd be most offended that you even asked a question as if you want to entertain the opposite, because it's just that taken for granted. Yeah.
But that's the nature. Like that's the nature of one of the benefits is like you can talk to someone like you or someone who's reasonable, and it does raise, I think, a good question. And so we can talk about it. And I don't know exactly. The problem is you have a lot of like German Lutherans tend to be very absolutist. And so you have your collection of German Lutherans who will just absolutely say interracial marriage is a sin. And here I am, like an Anglo guy saying, doing like the nuance bro thing where it's like, well, it's not a sin, but I understand
Via media, baby.
good and bad. And so anyway.
Yeah, great.
And I get lumped in with the Germans, and it's like, I'm not German. Like,
yeah, exactly. Thank God for our Anglican via media. So you should return to the church of your ancestors, my dude. But in any case,
yeah,
that's a great answer, because that question in particular, given how spicy it is, that's one where the ability to think like a pre-modern, and there was actually a good definition. Someone here did bring up a good point about what we think of pre-modern. I don't think it's bad to say pre-modern. High/late modernity really begins somewhere between the quote unquote Enlightenment and the Second Industrial Revolution. And so I guess when that's kind of what I'm thinking when I say pre-modern. Like, yes, technically the Reformation's in the early modern era, but it still is very much pre-modernist thought in that it's not quite how we think today. So I guess when I say pre-modern, I mean that. And so that question in particular, spicy questions like that, are the ones which demand more than others the ability to think with clarity, to not just whine at a conclusion, but to actually address premises and what follows from them, to make distinctions. And I forgot to mention earlier, even Thomistic categories of different kinds of distinctions, like virtual distinctions versus real distinctions, and even smaller subtypes between that. That's something really, really useful, which people should learn about, because you have to distinguish about different types of distinctions now. Which
you're doing like sacramental theology with virtual and all that. Yeah,
exactly. And that can help you think with even greater clarity. But yeah, questions like that do require the clearest of thinking that people can muster on these issues. And a good point here by David Wilson: forced population transfer has always been an instrument of empires to weaken nations and regional autonomy. And even in Holy Scripture, it's spoken as a judgment against Israel. What happens to the North Kingdom? What's God's judgment of them? They got subjugated and they got dispersed. In a modern biblicist, I believe in the Constitution worldview, population dispersal, how's that a judgment at all? Nations are just individuals, aren't they? So I mean, you can't really make sense of Scripture if you actually believe that. But in any event, my rambling's over now, because it's a question I've been dealing with a lot lately, especially with Australian politics, what's happening right now. But in any event, Oscar gives a super chat of our dollars. What is that meant to be? Robux or something? I'm not sure. But in any event, thank you so much for this super chat. We usually take the authority in Bible to mean the government, but in Brazil we have drug lord dominated favelas. They impose law, and some of them iconoclast laws. How do you see this state within a state?
Yeah, interesting. Stay within a state. I mean, a civil authority has the authority by the will of the people, like essentially a type of consent. I know you don't like consent. I think that's just classical Western political thought to affirm consent. It's even, I guess, even like Suarez and Vasquez, all those like good Jesuits affirmed. I guess
I'm just kind of reacting to the modern ideas of consent.
No. Consent is no. Consent is in Althusius. He calls it the efficient cause of political order. Yeah. So it's very common. It's in Rutherford and all that. But I know you're saying
as universal suffrage voting. It's not the same.
Yeah, right. So the mechanism of consent, can be different. So you can, like, no one could be able to vote, but still there's a sort of expression of consent. I don't know. That gets kind of tricky and fallacious at times. But I think the issue here, if they're not actually real laws, but it might be prudent if you're living in there to obey them, even though just because you may not be bound by conscience to obey these laws, but you may be bound by just good sense of not getting killed or something. I'm sorry, I don't know the situation. But that would be a problem. So it makes no sense to have two entities with competing jurisdictions over the same space. That's a contradiction. And so that would not be good. So I hope that does it. I mean, Paul, do you think that answers the question?
Yeah.
If I state within a state, I mean, the federalist structure, that federalism has a sort of state within a state model,
although,
but it's in principle, like, reconcilable, or it's coherent. Whereas to have what amounts to a contradictory or same jurisdiction contradictory authority, that doesn't make any sense. So
that's it, because with the state within the state of the United States, well, really most Western governments, like, there's smaller provincial authorities, but with the United States in particular, there's much greater authority historically. So that there is a formal relationship of states within states there with the United States. That'd be the difference. Whereas states within a states of, like, this big boy drug lord with tats all over him having his own informal jurisdiction in Brazil against the will of the Brazilian government, that's definitely a different matter. I think probably the one thing that would be useful, I guess, here would be to see that with Paul, he provides theological, metaphysical reasoning for submission to the state, but he also gives practical reasoning. The thing of the issue of, look, so that we can live in peace, so we don't invite the state's wrath. And so maybe one could argue that, depending on the situation, if there's not really going to be any opportunity anytime soon to just overthrow a local drug lord's control over a favela or whatever, maybe someone could argue from Paul's principles that, look, in the end, preserving life is a meaningful thing. And so if we can't replace this thing without mass bloodshed, the likes of which we haven't seen, then we may just have to tolerate it for the time being. And I don't know, it'll depend, I guess, on the nature of the drug lord's rule. Very tough question that we don't have to think about in our world, but I guess Brazilians do every day.
Well, we can conceive of a situation where the quote unquote official authorities may be utterly tyrannical, and what steps in would be this authority that seems kind of like a mafia, and they may not have any formal legitimacy, but in the end, they actually affect a lot of good, simply because they sometimes tyranny can produce anarchy, and so they order. But that just speaks to the fact that, like I've said many times, we live in a concrete situation. We have to make decisions based upon that situation for good. So if your principles always lead to bad, then you should think your principles. So anyway, that's how I would answer that.
It's a tough one to answer. So really, honestly, any answer would be somewhat helpful, at least. But Oscar, thank you so much for that super chat and for that very interesting question, one which we really don't think about a whole lot. So another one, J. Athanasius, love this one. Would Stephen Wolfe be willing to submit to an Anglican prince?
Yeah.
Let's go. One day, boys.
I would. I would have to if the prince is a legitimate authority. I would have to within the bounds of conscience. So if he's, I don't know, I want to go too far in it, but if he's commanding me to do something that I think would be an error, then I wouldn't do it. But if he's a legitimate authority, I'm not like a covenanter, like one of those guys.
Very true. Here's an interesting one by my man Pog. Is Christian nationalism an issue that churches should split over?
No, I'm not. No, don't do that. To split over it now. No, not Christian nationalism. No, I'll do that.
Now you're trying to come up with a nuance for how it might be permissible.
No, I'm just thinking that I don't think there's. If your pastor is like every week he sees the need to attack like Christian civil order.
Sure.
But by Christian nationalism, it's a fancy buzzword. It sells books. I do think my view is a Christian nationalist view, but in the end, what we're talking about is Christian civil order. Okay. Yep. So you can not agree with the label, but you can affirm Christian civil order, which many of my friends actually do that precisely, is they don't want to call themselves Christian nationalists, but we essentially agree on everything.
So I guess Pog is probably thinking just about the substance of Christian nationalism.
If it's like the substance, meaning it's a matter of civil order, I would say no. And mainly because, well, for one reason would be that, well, the church itself, as I said earlier, should not be like the hub of it. Like, it's not where you shouldn't think of the church as this like social organizing group from out of which you go and do your movement. I think there should be a supportive role ideally, but like even the church I go to, I don't think all the elders and the pastor, as far as I understand, wouldn't affirm many of the principles I affirm on that. But I'm happy to be there. So.
Yeah, I have to greatly agree with that, because as you just said, it is a matter of the state, and in the end, the church is a distinct realm with its own distinct mission, and so that's why I like to conceive of the church, particularly the Sunday gathering, and perhaps even the building itself, as basically the embassy of heaven on earth. And so when you walk into another country's embassy, you're not going in there with like, yeah, Australia, with the Australian flag or whatever. No. It's its own country. You got to respect it as its own thing. That the kingdom of heaven in the end is, well, it's on earth, yes, but it is a distinct kingdom in its own right. And so we should treat it like that and not bring matters of state insofar as they don't directly affect the church, which there are such matters, but insofar as they don't directly affect our church's mission, it's a separate matter, and that definitely shouldn't be a thing to split over in and of its own right. So we have a few more questions here. So do you have a limit for how long to go for? Because we've gone for a bit already. Or is there still a bit?
Yeah, no, I'm fine. Yeah,
perfect.
We can keep going. Yeah,
excellent.
Good questions so far.
Yeah, they are. I will say though, I've come to the conclusion, to give my own little aside, I've come to the conclusion that obviously there's people who detract from Christian nationalism, quote unquote, but they're only really detracting to the label, or they're opposing kind of a poor straw man view of it, or what have you. But then you'll have the more thought out people, and I speak of that in a relative sense, not that they have really good arguments, but more thought out people who are more clear in what they're saying, the likes, whether it be Owen Strachan or Blake Callens or whoever, where they will directly point to the proposition of a nation's government ought to submit to Christ as Lord and rule accordingly, and they will directly oppose that idea. And with that, and so I guess it would be my question to you, I'd love to hear what you think, but when I see someone directly opposing the proposition clearly stated in that way, that very basic proposition, I take it as a denial of the lordship of Christ itself, the universal lordship of Christ itself, which is a dangerous heresy. So I wonder what you take on that.
Yeah, I think that would be that is a type of like denying that Christ has authority over the civil realm. I think that they would deny that they're denying that.
I think so too. Yeah,
I don't think they would say that Christ is not Lord. So I think it's someone like Scott Aniol, or how do you say his name? He would take a modern 2K approach with basically the mode of reign. The mode of reign over the civil authority would be one in which you can't order things to the spiritual kingdom, I think that he would say. So he would say there is an actual Christ as Lord. I mean, you could throw in, like, say it's Nestorian, but it may not actually. There are some questions like a Christological question when it comes to in what sense in which Christ reigns over the civil.
Christ creates a neutral space.
I mean, that I think it's all silly, but I think that's what they would say. I don't even know that there's some people who are reacting to Christian nationalism who have PhDs in theology, who I think really don't know exactly what they're talking about. I'm not saying Scott Aniol is one of those people, but there are people I think within his general organization who really didn't have to think about it in very distinct, clear ways, because they the whole neutral world thing. Yeah, they thought the enemy was post-mill, or they like some sort of post-mill exegesis, or it was theonomy, or maybe it's like neo-Calvinist transformationalism. I mean, this also goes for people like Van Drunen. Like even to this day, he sees of himself as opposing those people, as opposed to like a more classical conception of two kingdoms. But how to get on that? But
it's that becomes the tough question of like the nature of defining Christian heresy writ large, because you can have the proposition and then the direct logical outcome of that. Like, to what extent where does the buck stop with respect to the logical outcome of a position entailing heresy versus just an honest error, but the person's not a heretic, if that makes sense? A key example, obviously, being the Trinity, because you'll get various Trinitarian heretics who will say, in a sense, Christ is God, but the logical outworking of their system leads to an error which has been deemed heretical. And so I guess the way I conceive of it with this is that it's not like you have to go 12 billion steps down the logical line and then, oh, look, it's a heresy, therefore you're a heretic. No, because every theological proposition conceivable, if you go down logically down the line, will either be consistent or will break. So we can't deem something heretical just because it could logically lead to an error. But I do think in the case of this, it's pretty much just one step. Even though they claim, and they will, Onstrand, Callens, whoever, they will claim, yes, Christ is Lord. He has all authority. But I'd say that, like, look, that is just directly inconsistent in just the single logical step, with also claiming that states don't have an obligation to submit to him as states, because the basic, and against the big bad natural law philosophy, I guess, and even just biblical presuppositions, that if someone has authority over you, you are ipso facto obligated to submit to him and act accordingly. Yeah. And so that's why I guess I'd say it's just a single step. I guess the single step denial. Yeah.
I guess the question, like, I guess maybe to defend them, the question is that what's the condition for them to accept Christ as Lord? Is it a formal declaration in a sort of constitutional document? Is it acting for the good of the church? Like, this is what I would say. Like, I would say is that a civil government recognizes the reign of Christ over it through serving the Christian aspect of a Christian people.
Yep.
So that's what I think. It's action. It's not formal declaration.
Yeah,
that's good, important, but in itself, the recognition is the action. So I don't think a state that does nothing to serve the spiritual interests of its people, but has in their constituting documents that we affirm God in this, I don't think that's in appearance only. It's a matter of action. So would these guys then say, oh well, so it's recognizing the temporal interests of people, and that's it, and that's the action of it, recognition. Well, he said, I mean, if I affirm what they believe, that's what I would argue, at least.
Sure.
But that raises the question, all sorts of issues, I think. I don't know if we'll go into that. But yeah, I mean, I do think it's a legitimate question. Like, are they in the end kind of denying something that's a pretty central tenet of the faith?
Yeah, material. Gabriel puts it here: material or formal heresy. That's kind of the question I guess we're asking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pog thanks you for the detailed answer. I have to agree as well. That question on just whether churches should split over the issue, and derivative from that, what's the nature of how grave is the error of denying the basic premise underlying Christian nationalism? That really practically pertinent questions that go beyond the abstractions of theology. And
if I heard that a church split over my book, I'd be kind of pissed off. But I would. But I guess there could be in a sense in which that it would be legitimate, but not over the label. Like, we want to be a Christian nationalist church. It's like, okay, well, anyway, I've already answered the question. But
yeah, and it actually leads very naturally onto this next question, which is also a very good one. For the ignorant, could you distinguish post-war consensus R2K and classical 2K?
Post-war consensus R2. That's great. That is a good term for that. And R2K, you could call it radical. I like calling them modernist 2K because I think it's not actually very radical. It's just essentially post-war consensus 2K. So what is that? It's post-war consensus 2K. Like, what is the post-war consensus? It's after World War II, essentially everyone's like, we don't want that to, the whole never again sort of thinking. So what does that mean? Well, you're going to have secularism, multiculturalism, anti-nationalism. You're going to have essentially a type of liberal order in which, like, law doesn't function to promote the good as much as it just allows you to have identities and expression within the sphere of public life. And so it's essentially like modern liberalism. And so what is two kingdom theology in that sense? Well, it would be Christ reigns over both kingdoms, but the temporal kingdom, or the civil earthly side, is their concern is nothing but preservation. So the civil government authority acts upon society to preserve things, not to order and direct things to the good. Right. So that perfectly aligns. And Van Druden's very clear about this, in that he says that by principle, not prudence, like prudence is different, but in principle, a state by absolute principle ought to promote be multicultural, anti-nationalist, secularist. He was recently asked by DeYoung on a podcast that this is DeYoung asking David Van Drunen. Probably Van Drunen is probably the most famous R2K M2K guy. He was asked if, let's say, a bunch of Presbyterians start a colony on Mars, and they're all like-minded theologically, and they wanted to have like a Sabbath law, would that please God? And Van Drunen essentially said it would not. Like, it would not please God to have I think it was Sabbath law, but whatever it was related to their Christian side of existence.
So they can't even enforce their own unanimous interest.
Yeah, like they are, government is by principle so limited that government cannot have any cognizance of the higher eternal things such that they can order them people to it. So that is what I'd say is R2K. Now, classical 2K is, I think well, I mean, there's different versions, but like the basic distinction would be within the civil realm. The civil realm ought to order people, or can, at least in principle, order people to the highest good, which would be heavenly life, which would include a church establishment.
Yeah.
Potentially, does it have to be, but if it's fitting and suitable. But there's cognizance, meaning that civil rulers can know not only in their personal life the true God and the true faith, but they can know it as magistrate and order their subjects or people to that. That would be but whereas R2K wants to limit within just purely temporal, without any cognizance or understanding or knowledge of the higher. So this is why like Richard Hooker would be classical 2K. I mean, even Erastus is a sort of 2K, as I understand. Yeah. Rutherford's 2K, Calvin's 2K. And this is probably best understood as like a twofold kingdom instead of a two kingdoms, meaning that there really is one kingdom, but there's two modes of distinctions of reign. One is primarily concerned with temporal, one is with spiritual, and the temporal is mediated, meaning that civil magistrates can actually institute and act their own law in conformity with the natural law, and they are sort of like vicar of Christ or vicar of God on earth. That is a civil magistrate. I know that sounds like,
papist.
That's a classical view. Okay, it's not like me inserting some weird fascism. But then the church, and maybe probably don't totally agree with this, but the church does not have a mediatory role. It has a ministerial role. It administers the things of God, but the minister is not a mediator in the same sense that the Roman Church has.
Absolutely agreed. Yeah,
right. So whereas the civil authority has a mediating role, the church has a ministerial role. Okay, that's the idea. Okay. So hopefully that's a big long answer. I don't, and if I have to repeat myself, you can ask. But
if you have to repeat yourself, people can use the concept called the rewind. But in any event,
like what did he say?
Yeah, exactly. Kesroni here says this is interesting. I haven't seen this. Richard Hooker makes a Christological argument in defense of the National Church of England. I haven't read that from him. Have you? Or?
Yeah, it's Christological in the sense that, like, because there was a debate and it went on for a long time until it became kind of irrelevant. And the debate was, does Christ, like, everyone affirmed that Christ reigns over the civil authority, but does he reign as mediator, or does he reign as Son of God, as just simply the Son of God? And the concern is that if you if you say he doesn't reign as like, or does he reign as God, or does he reign as the God man? And there's like a Nestorian concern that the Presbyterians are lead to down the line for not, if I don't Kessroner, whatever, he or she,
they them.
I'm assuming he, because this is a, anyway, I won't get into that, get in trouble.
Caesar.
But yeah, it is. I think that's the argument. And like modern day people, like Brad Littlejohn makes that argument. I've seen him make that argument. No one's accused me of that yet, even though if you accused me of it, you'd have to accuse Turretin of it as well. That's one of the collateral damages.
Yeah, there's very little appreciation, as we discussed very much early on in the discussion. There's little appreciation often from some of the collateral damage of their arguments. With respect to the reform figures that they venerate. And Eli Fritz does say that was very helpful, much appreciated. So that's good to hear. And here is a fun one. Aquinas, Scotus, Suarez, or Rutherford? Which one is the best political philosopher?
I haven't read a lot of Scotus. I guess that's me. That's a deficiency, personal failure. Better political philosopher, man. I do like Suarez. He does say goofy things about the Pope, but other than that, I do like it. But the interesting thing is what I like about Suarez is in Rutherford. It's hilarious that Rutherford is writing against a Roman Catholic, and he's citing a bunch of Roman Catholics against them. And so, yeah, I guess I would say Rutherford. That's a good question. I honestly don't. Honestly, maybe Aquinas better. Probably Aquinas. I like him better in political philosophy, to be honest. Yeah, than even Rutherford.
Very interesting.
But don't hold me too strongly to that.
So even over Rutherford, that's interesting.
Well, I think because Aquinas he puts a lot more weight on the prelapsarian state, or the state of innocence, in his political thought. And that's what I do as well. And so I kind of like that. And I haven't seen Rutherford do that very much. Whereas like I try to do a lot of grounding of my understanding of politics from theorizing about the state of integrity.
Yeah.
And so does Aquinas.
Right. Well, I think G3 has a new headline. Stephen Wolfe is a Thomist papist plant confirmed.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
Oh man!
But actually, can I address that on the Thomist?
Please, yes.
You know what's hilarious about the Thomist accusation? It is true that I'm influenced by Thomas Aquinas and a lot of the thinking around that. But then so was everyone else. Like I mentioned Laplace. You read that and people think he's a Thomist, but and he probably is more than others. But it was just he just influenced the way people talked about ethics and politics and theology. And it wouldn't be proper to say that I'm like, a Thomist and that's what I am. I'm probably more than that. But I think most of what people say is Thomism is really just how everyone thought and the methods that they used prior to recent times.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think it's kind of late. Honestly, every time I see it, I think it just betrays ignorance it is
one of those,
and the sources.
Yeah, it's one of those litmus test questions. It's really a concept I've come to appreciate a lot more recently, where there's certain kinds of questions and opinions that you can hear people promulgate with regard to specific debates. And when you hear that particular question or opinion from them, it's a confirmation that, okay, you don't know what you're talking about, really. Or you've been very badly malformed by this or that source.
And if you read like Turretin, he deals with some of the things that Aquinas says that he doesn't agree with, but from my reading, most of the time he cites him positively, and he also likes to cite him against other Roman Catholics. Like he cites at one point, he says, "Well, look at this. Thomas Aquinas is closer to us than Bellarmine. Oh, look, Bellarmine saw the need to oppose Thomas on this issue, but he's on our side on this and that." So people were not as afraid to say that he was a great theologian or just a great thinker, and they were not afraid to appropriate from him what they thought was good and useful.
Yeah, yeah. And there's definitely another user question or another viewer question very relevant to this. How should Protestants receive / engage with Aquinas?
Yeah, like just what I just said there. So read it and deal with the arguments, and but you don't have to become a Thomist. Like if you take this or that argument, again, a lot of times you'll just, if you read Aquinas and then you read Reformed scholastics, you'll be like, yeah, that sounds a lot like what Thomas Aquinas said. And does that make that guy a Thomist? It's just, yeah. So I think just read him if you want like a reliable reading. I would just say read him through the Reformed scholastics, if that's possible. I mean, it's tricky, you have to find it, but even people like I was just reading Thomas Goodwin the other day, who was a Congregationalist in 17th century England, and he's citing Aquinas and positively as an authority, not as like, oh well, this guy also happens to agree. It's like here's a guy saying it too. So yeah,
fascinating. Congregationalists citing Aquinas.
Well, I think they all did it. I think there was I'm not aware, and I'm sure there is somewhere, but I'm not aware of anyone in these periods like freaking out over the influence of Thomas in Reformed thought. There's actually Turton says something on the question of voluntarism. So voluntarism is the idea, divine voluntarism is the idea of, it's a question of what's the relationship between moral life, our more like I'll just say ethics and the nature of God. So is it good simply because God commanded it, or is it good because it flows from the nature of God in some sense? Turton actually says in one point that instead of being the Occam nominalist boogeyman or Scotus, he says most people within the Reformed world are actually followers of Aquinas on that question. Okay. So and without he did a little qualification, but anyway, so it was very common to do that, and people weren't so anxious, like there wasn't so much anxiety about it.
Yeah,
to my knowledge.
Yeah, from what I've seen as well, there wasn't really a freak out over Thomism. Peccator justificatus, very good question here. What do you think about Roman Catholic integralism and Eastern Orthodox nationalism? Is it just Caesaropapism and Papo-Caesarism?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of welcome some of the integralism, mainly because I want Roman Catholics to be more honest about their political theology.
Yeah.
That you literally believe that the Pope can do these things, that he is the originator of authority and it's devolved from him. It's a devolution system, meaning that the power of civil authority is granted from the spiritual power on earth to the civil authorities, which means if you grant something, you can rescind it. And of course that happened all the time. So I actually I welcome it because I think it's more honest so in that sense, but I disagree with that. So I think that civil authority is derived independent of the spiritual power, and the spiritual power is derived independent of the temporal power. And they're, in a sense, they come from the same source, but they are ultimately, and they have to be mutually supportive on earth, but they're not, one does not come from the other. Whereas Roman Catholics, they don't believe that, at least traditionally. Eastern Orthodox, I don't know much about that. Paul, you probably know more about that than I do, so I can't speak on that.
He may be thinking of, because with Easternism, there's definitely the bigger accusation, more commonly, of how they tend to be quite ethnophilatist with their churches. So with the East, it's not exclusive to the East. Obviously, you have it in other traditions too, but Eastern Orthodoxy is more famous for being ethnophilatist, and that you'll have your Serbian Orthodox Church, your Russian Orthodox Church, your Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There's one relatively near me. And they are ethnic. They are, properly speaking, ethnic churches, such that in many cases, if you're Mr. Tombro from SoCal and you walk in to like a Ukrainian Orthodox church during the liturgy, they'll just kind of give you a weird look like that, and they'll be like, no, other church that way, get out. And then that kind of problem, it's kind of a common issue. It's not universal, but it is a very, very common issue in the East, where they take the idea of a national church, not really in the same sense as like a like we agree, we've somewhat agreed here, like there's going to be distinct nations and they'll have their own churches, and so ipso facto from that, there's going to be churches that are like 99% whites, and then over in Nigeria, 99% Nigerians, if not 100%. It's a natural thing, and it's a good thing for a nation as a nation to want to have some level of homogeneity. But the East, in many areas, brings that even to the level of the church gathering, wherein if you have someone who's not of your people walk into the church building, they may have a problem with that, and they just don't want you to commune with them.
Wasn't there a council? Wasn't that deemed heresy at some point? That the idea of denying,
it should be. Maybe it was.
No, I think it's. I think it's hugely. I was going to say the word problematic, but that's kind of gay. But I mean, there's something. Yeah, I think there's a big problem there. If you're going to deny like a true believer on the basis of a temporal, like a earthly distinction. Like you're literally offering things that like the church offers things that transcend race, ethnicity, male, female. I mean, it's the whole point of the idea that you're one in Christ. This is one of my issues with Lutherans too. Not along like ethnic lines, but how they you have to be a strict Lutheran in order to take me. I don't agree with that with Lutherans, because you offer things that transcend your own church, including Lutheran church. If you affirm my church to be a true church, then I mean there can be a procedure, but to ensure that I'm worthy or whatever. But still, there should be, the principle should not be that you're not Lutheran or sufficiently theologically the same. But anyway, I think that's a big problem. But.
Yeah, I have to agree. Brandon Corley here asks, would you reword civil power of the prince comes immediately from God as the root of civil power, but the people by their consent are the instrument or mode by which God confers it on people? As in, it seems in essence affirms civil power comes immediately from God.
Yeah. Are you quoting me or Rutherford?
That
might be me. I'm essentially summarizing what I'm actually rewording something Rutherford said if that's what I said.
Also, is this from you?
Yeah. So this is it's a little kind of confusing. So let's see the essence of firm silver.
So he's saying that
it's me. Do I say immediately? Yeah. But the idea being that it's civil power is in a sense devolved from God to the civil authority, but the kind of sort of intermediary condition for that to occur would be the consent of the people for that to happen. And so that's where consent comes in. And also consent, and also added element would be the arrangement. So just because there is this thing called civil power doesn't mean that it's going to be instantiated in our life in the same exact way. So you can have a king, you can have a mixed regime, you could have an aristocracy, you could have what we have. And so I hope that answers the question. That's what I was trying to get at there. I was trying to, because there is that issue of, well, if it comes immediately from God, or it comes from God to the civil authority, in what sense does the nation or the people relate to that devolving of power, right? So that's the issue.
Yeah.
And so the typical, and that phrase, I think that's like Suarez and Bellarmine says it, and then Rutherford takes it from them. That's that the people are a sort of type of intermediary or the mode by
Yeah.
which that happens.
Yeah, because I
that
was
makes
slightly
sense.
confused by his wording here, because he seems to imply, when he says that you said it comes immediately from God, that you're positing God as the instrument, when it's the other way around. God's the root.
Oh,
The
okay.
people are the instrument. The people.
Yeah,
So
when I say like immediately, what I mean is that the laws themselves that govern us are from God immediately, meaning that the civil magistrate is that one who deliberates, enacts, and promulgates those laws in society,
Yep.
and he has true lawmaking authority. But those laws are only true laws, and they're only if they're laws of God. For them to be laws of God, they have to be derived from God's law, or essentially the moral law or natural law. So that's actually what makes a law a true law and binding of conscience, because that law is rooted in the natural law, which is God's law, and that's why it's binding. So ultimately, the laws bind because of God, operating immediately through civil magistrates.
Yeah,
hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So basically, civil authority comes ultimately from God, and it's instantiated practically by the consent of the people.
I mean, with regard to that's installing the civil authority would be the consent of the people.
Yeah.
The mediary question, if I'm understanding the question right.
With the enactment of law.
That's a matter of the enactment of civil or positive law in society.
Sure. Right.
But the installation of the civil authority is from God, but still a decision and by the consent of the people.
Sure. Right.
Yeah, that's how I understand it, at least.
That makes sense. From my friend here, what does Stephen think of Constantine and his legacy to Christianity? Now, this is a question I'm interested in too.
I wish I had I wish I had a good answer for that question. Actually, I need to read Lightheart's book on Constantine. I obviously like the creation of Christian civil order. So if you want to think of a legacy of Constantine, that's like his actions were central to that creation in the West.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I would say his legacy is good with regard to Christian civil order. But I don't have a really good worked out view that I'd want to say on Constantine himself.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah. I discussed basically this exact question on our mutual friends program, Contra Mundum podcast, with Pastor Isker and CJ Engel, to basically this whole issue of how, Christian nationalism is fundamentally comes from the early church with Constantine, with emperors like Theodosius I and the Second, with the first Theodosius the First establishing Nicene Christianity as the state religion, the state church, with some toleration a little bit for the Novatians, but that's another question. But so I went on their podcast, and that's basically where I spoke of, look, if at one point I made the observation, and this was kind of the thrust of the podcast, how essentially you have the anti-Christian nationalists have to oppose basically the in some material sense the foundations of modern Christianity, which was largely instantiated by emperors. And so I said, like, look, we've got to remember councils, like all the councils, especially Nicaea, those were imperial projects. And that's something I'm emphasizing in as a research thing for my current apologetics of Rome in the East, to basically say, look, your idea of the magisterium, that wasn't some divine mandate. It was an imperial project. It was a man-made, it was a good thing, but it's still a man-made thing. And in this regard, I basically say, look, people, whether you're Owen Strachan or whoever, people who viciously oppose Christian nationalism, look, as a matter of principle, you would have had to, if you were told that, hey, Emperor Constantine is ordering a council at Nicaea, or hey, Theodosius is ordering a council at Constantinople to solve these massive questions within the church. If you're an anti-Christian nationalist, in principle, you would have to say, no, this is wrong. We cannot have these councils. We must oppose them. And yet we all take for granted that these councils, in a material sense, they actually laid the foundations of modern Christianity, and they quashed, and the imperial actions that followed them, they quashed these massive heretical movements that, if the councils didn't happen, and if the emperors didn't do what they did, these heresies would be around for much longer at least, and there'd be a lot more lost souls as a result. And so that was the basic argument I said. And so I guess to give my own answer to this question, his legacy can't really be understated for Christianity.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah. Yeah, and I think too, just the recognition that we as Reformed or Protestant, you don't like the word Protestant, but as classical Protestant, whatever Christians, the role of political will in making what we have today, from the confessions to then going back to the creeds, it was a matter of political will that so many of these things came about. I mean, just think of the Reformation. The Reformation, at least with regard to how providence worked its way out, the Christian princes were essential to the success of the Reformation.
Yeah. Who did the term Protestant refer to?
Oh, the civil, the civil rule, yeah. So I mean, you have to recognize that that is political will, which also this also means that it's a justification or a reason for us as Christians to be more assertive politically. It's to believe that we shouldn't be restrained or shouldn't constrain ourselves, that politics and exerting political will on behalf of Christian faith has in the past produced these great documents that we cherish today. And so we should not in principle be afraid of political will. That doesn't mean that we should just be imprudent, but it does mean that we should not be utterly so terrified of it that we would not never in principle use it.
That's right. Yeah, it's that problem. Anti-Christian nationalist problem of having such a religious devotion to, frankly, a secular principle. Like you have, Strachan basically gave a creedal statement in that talk. I believe in the Constitution. I believe in democracy. It's yes, the G3 Creed of 2023 is this. It was a religious statement. If you just take it at face value, it was a religious statement, which is very alarming. But in any event, the whole thing of sacrificing real on the ground progress and protection of the faith because of these abstract principles, which aren't even biblical to begin with, but whatever. It's a disaster in our modern view. Here's another interesting. It seems we only have a couple of questions left. We had a lot of great questions and a lot of great answers to them so far. I think we only have a couple remaining now. H.J. Evan asks, I don't know how it's ethical to legislate from things believed to be of divine origin, except that the divine make a new miracle affirming that source. What do you say about that?
Okay.
Stephen completely stumped.
Yeah. No, I'm looking at that. So I'm trying to understand the question. I think this is a good question in the sense that I don't know exactly where H.J. Evans coming from on this, but it is a problem I tried to resolve in the book, if I understand your point. And that is, if you say that the church, that civil government is a fundamentally human thing, it's not a Christian thing. Fundamentally, it's and natural law is a universally human thing, and all laws ought to be based upon natural law, and natural law is a human thing. How can you then legislate something that is of grace? So it's a legitimate question. And the way I address this is to say that, excuse me, that something something of grace can be the second step in the application of a natural principle. So the syllogism I use in the book is something to the effect of civil government ought to order the people to the true religion. Okay, so true religion is basically the middle term in the syllogism, and with the second statement being Christianity is a true religion. So the first statement, civil government ought to direct people to true religion, is a principle of nature. That is, it's a principle that is true universally. It every single civil government ought to do that in some sense, some capacity of nature. But the second statement is a statement of grace, and but the conclusion would ultimately be that civil government ought to direct people to Christianity. So in that sense, it's a mixed syllogism in which there's a proposition of divine origin, but fundamentally it's actually meeting it's fulfilling a natural principle for civil government. And this can be true. And the idea of a mixed syllogism is, I didn't make that up. Like, the idea of a mixed syllogism is used quite often in like polemics in theology. So I don't want to start a debate on the sacraments, but there is the, like, Turretin, and a common argument against Roman Catholic position is like the idea that it starts from a natural, like, an axiomatic statement, like no body can be in two places at once, right? And then it says Christ is in heaven, and therefore he cannot be on earth. Something like that. I'm butchering it. I'm not a theologian. That's my out. But that's the idea. Is the first one is an axiomatic statement of creation. Second one is a truth of grace, but it follows from that. So that's how I would answer that. I know it's a long answer, but it's actually a very good question that I don't think people people consider very often. Like, how can, again, a natural authority that is kind of a natural authority legislate something that is essentially a divine law, as opposed to a natural law, or divine supernatural proposition as opposed to a natural one. So hopefully that may not even be what you're asking, but that's my answer.
It seems your answer comes from that concern we discussed again in the main discussion of basically, look, does the conclusion follow from the premise? Are the premises themselves sound, and does the conclusion follow from that? And with this respect, you have premises of, look, is this thing actually divinely revealed? Yes. And then, does this pertain to nature? Yes. Have those premises follow, and then that's basically a warrant. And it's something that seems very related to the Reformation debate of the Romanist objection, that the Reformation, it didn't have legitimacy on any grounds because they lacked what they would call, like Francis de Sales, for example, he'd call it mission. They lacked a direct divine warrant, like whether it be a new revelation or miracles, what have you. They lacked that divine warrant to engage in the Reformation. And so the whole project, regardless of their argumentation, it was illegitimate to begin with because they didn't have that warrant. Whereas the Reformation, their response was basically, no, look, we have the warrant ipso facto from divine revelation, and we do maintain continuity with the church, but we have warrant from divine revelation itself. You guys are opposing it, and in the scriptures and in the church itself, people are told not to submit to these like heretical ideas and what have you. Ipso facto, then we have that warrant to object to the Church of Rome and what it's doing, because you guys don't have that authority that you claim. So it seems like two related debates there, I guess.
Okay.
And so that's a big question, I guess, as well, the nature of authority between the supernatural and the natural. Interesting question or comment by Athanasius. So Stephen's not a stark, mad, raving lunatic? I'd swear he almost sounds, Ronald Reagan, forgive me, reasonable.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
That's right. Hey, I can attest.
Well, you know what's funny is that I've been to several events, and in a few of those events, after I talk with people afterwards, or during the like Q&A or whatever, they think that I'm like a firebrand sort of preacher, where I'm just going to go up there and I'm going to start denouncing people as Satan and stuff, and like,
we must rebuild Christendom. We must.
Yeah, what I'm really, I mean, there's a place for that, and pastors that's what they ought to do. But I'm ultimately just an academic, and maybe a little more than that. So that's my role in all this thing. I'm not against the firebrand, but that's not me personally. So. Mm-hmm. Fair enough. But I don't think I'm a lunatic. Maybe a little mad, but
fair enough. well, now we got 2 more questions. Unfortunately, another one's just come up, but this one, spicy but an important one in my opinion.
Why are you a
What's Stephen's
racist?
view of the
Okay.
church's relationship with the Jews and a Christian nation's relationship with Israel, if a relationship even exists?
Yeah, so I mean, I take I would say the classical view, and that there's one people of God, and the Jews can be in or out, but unless they accept Christ, they're not in. Does that mean there's like a retaining, like a sort of a blessing for the future for the Jews of conversion? I haven't come to a solid opinion on that, but I would tend to say that is the case.
I think some
But
reformers
in
did
terms,
give that opinion,
what's that?
that the Jews would convert in the future. I think some reformers gave that opinion, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that's actually the most common opinion. I could be wrong. It's not an issue I've studied very closely. I think because I really don't. Yeah, I'm not like a dispensationalist, and I cringe at these ideas that like when people say Jews are God's people, it's like I cringe at those things. And relationship with Israel, I think the state of Israel is just like any other state, country, and in the world. And I don't think we don't have any obligation to it, special obligation apart from geopolitical consideraons.
Wow. Okay, anti-Semite. Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, I would be. I can't stand the fact that we. I mean, on that question, if I don't, I guess I don't have like a perfect articulation of all these views, but one of the things that's really weird is, so I experienced a lot of like moralistic opposition from a lot of evangelical people for a year. And then this Israel-Gaza thing happens, and all these guys suddenly are calling for what without using the word, genocide against Gaza. Like, and so it was really kind of weird. Like, these people bomb them, and like some other guys, like, it's good that this one guy got blown up, and his children as collateral damage. And it's just like, wow, it's like there is a weird within evangelical world and dispensationalism and everything goes on with that. There is a weird willingness to be extremely negative about even a politically assertive Christian people in America. But then Israel, if you want to bomb the hell out of a country and kill thousands, tens of thousands of people, go right ahead. I mean, it's just so weird.
Hey, they dropped the pamphlets. It's okay.
Yeah, the dropping pamphlets. I mean, whatever. I'm not going to attack. Honestly, like, my opinion of this is that it's really far away. I've never been to these people. I don't know any Israelis. I don't know any Palestinians.
Yeah.
I don't want to go to war with anyone. I don't want to be dropped in there, parachuted in there. It's just another conflict in the world. I mean, does anyone know that in Darfur there's ethnic cleansing going on right now over the last couple of months? No one knows about that because they're fixated on Israel. But yeah, I just treat it as just another conflict in the world, and we should treat it like that as well.
Yeah.
Am I canceled?
Yeah, there goes my channel. Goodbye.
Canceled from what, right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, you're gonna get you're brought down.
Oh man, I was already that people tried to do that with I don't know if you ever saw my posts on the right of people to question a certain event, and it's not a sin to do that in and of itself. And people try to bring me down for that, but no, I'm still here. But in any event,
still here,
baby, still kicking.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's being raised. I was raised Pentecostal, and so it was kind of the norm just to kind of have this frothing at the mouth obsession over Israel. But then looking back in retrospect, like kind of dropping that, but still having kind of a default mindset where Israel's somehow kind of special, it should be defended against the evil Palestinians, but then even just dropping that and just treating Israel as an equal, just like all else being equal, just another nation out there. I look back and it really is just insane to see the level of obsession over a tiny little nation in a completely different continent that has nothing to do with how we live here. Like, why this level of obsession? And we don't do the same, as you say, places like Darfur or Yemen. That's the other common example. Yemen and the Saudi Arabian government. Like, what's up? Why don't we obsess over that? It really has become weird, and it shows that there's actually greater interests involved with these topics and with obsession over countries. But In any event, we'll now get to our final question of the night, and I left this one to last because it really is a forward-looking question. Where does Stephen think Christian nationalism will go from here?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. The book's been out for about 14 months or so, 13 months. And about every 2 months that go by, I think, oh yeah, it's over now. Like it's gonna mellow out. There won't be as much heat on me, this and that. But then something goes boom and blows up. And it's not even what I tweet. It's other people are suddenly attacking me, like G3. Like I didn't even know who those people were. Honestly, I mean, I knew the names, but I didn't know the organization existed. It's not my world. I'm Presbyterian, not Baptist. And so I didn't know those people. And all of a sudden they're attacking me. And then it's like O'Fallon, who used to be a friend, is now attacking me. And his bunch of people are lying about me, and then over and over and over. And so, yeah, where does it go from here? It's hard to say because it always feels like, okay, the conversation's dying down and boom. And now today there's that drop, that trailer. So it's wild. And someone told that I might be in it briefly. So I don't know. We'll find out. It's probably not nice, whatever it is, or it's whatever, but yeah, but where does it go from here? I've always said that like the label itself, I'm less committed to the label than the ideas.
Yep.
And so I'm very happy with people who like the ideas and don't take the label. And I think within the Reformed denominations, I think even the elites within the denomination, I think they know that. I think we're at a point where people are starting to say we need to go back further than the American Revision or like 20th century Reformed thought. We need to go back a little bit. And even if they want to affirm the American Revision, they're going to have a more robust view of it, because you can interpret it as a little bit differently to have a more like Christian order. But so yeah, like where does I think we'll go from here? It's so hard to say where things will head. People they talk about Christian nationalism as a movement, and they kind of look at me as like the movement leader. And there are a bunch, there's like a sort of cohort that affirms the label and is very active on Twitter and social media generally. So I think that will continue, and they have a lot of fun doing what they do, and it's usually hilarious. And so I think that'll continue. But yeah, like if I was like a true movement leader, I'd be up here shouting and saying, we're going to take over Congress tomorrow and this and that. But in the end, I think we should just within our own spheres of influence, if you don't like the label, but you like the ideas or some of the ideas, just talk about these things, bring them up with friends. If you have a men's group, let's talk about these things. Read an old book like Althusius or Franciscus Junius's Mosaic Polity. Like read these kind of books. That's a book I should have mentioned about law, about civil law, Junius's political Mosaic Polity. Anyway, it's getting late up here. What was I going to say? Yeah, so just keep doing stuff like that, and we can. Yeah. If in the end the label Christian nationalism dies out, but then all of a sudden everyone believes in Christian civil rulers, then I'm perfectly happy with that. Yeah. And I hope that at least will go forward just like that. Sorry if that's not like, hey, what do I do right now with my time? But
no,
just keep building, keep building. I don't know if that's what Inquiring Christian is asking, but just keep building friendships, institutions if you have the possibility. So
yeah, that's the actually, if anything, the diversification of the ideas beyond just the label of Christian nationalism is actually a good thing, because it kind of dodges the whole Saul Alinsky tactic of like capture something in a label and just like you just have the enemy and you punch it there. If the same ideas are diversified across any number of labels, it's much harder to really pin down and stop, because you can have multiple groups surrounding different labels and all that, and it achieves the ends faster. And likewise, just the idea of like don't just leave everything in theory, like what you're saying here, do stuff, build stuff. And likewise, what our friends at Contramundum talk about a lot, don't just theorize and postulate and debate these things. Like, get some action happening. These are real world things we're talking about. You're not going to instantiate your heckin' based Christian empire just by winning the debates. You've got to actually physically walk into these places and do things and gain power that way.
Yeah, and see like the broad project of not Christian nationalism, but just I don't know what you want to call it, like classical Christian thought or something. See that as people with different roles. So I have a certain gift, if you want to call it that, for something, and I try to exercise that gift the best I can. Other people who have a different personality can then be more of a foot soldier for these ideas. Some people can be the writers, and some people can kind of be the sloganeers or the funny memes and the videos. All these, everyone kind of has a part in this. And so see what you are, and how you can contribute to, again, not like the term, but to the idea of having a civil order that recognizes Christ and acts accordingly.
Yeah.
So,
100%.
I don't know. Is that good?
I reckon that's a
how long? Whoa, it's like been 2.5 hours.
Exactly. Man. Yeah, exactly. An inquiring Christian does also say he really enjoyed your book. I have some disagreements, but appreciate moving the discussion forward. I especially benefited from the chapter on nations. So,
thank you. Yeah, I have disagreements too. So we're on the same boat.
There you go.
How could I write 500 pages and a year later agree with everything I said? That would be ridiculous. Come on, people grow.
If you know, you know. But in any event, this was an excellent discussion. That's all the questions we have for now. But ladies and gentlemen, I hope all of you watching really gained a lot in terms of how to think through these issues, how to think in general, really. Where you can go for great resources to read about the questions of classical political theology, political thought. As well as what you can do yourself as well, in light of the state of our world and the God willing, the need to help bring about nations that really do follow Christ as nations and even their governments therein. And so, in light of all of that, Stephen Wolfe, thank you so much for coming on to the program.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great discussion.
Excellent. I thought it was a fantastic one myself. And so in light of that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for watching. This has been Dr. Stephen Wolfe, and this has been the other Paul. I hope you all have a lovely day or evening. God bless.